Everybody. Welcome to the Winter Workshop of 2022. I know few of you joined after we did the housekeeping a few minutes ago, so I'm just going to repeat that information. I think you should all be muted when you arrive, but if you can, feel free to unmute yourself if you need to talk. And but while the presenters are presenting, we request that if you have any questions, put them in the chat. One of us will be monitoring the chat to make sure all questions and comments are covered. However, towards the end of each session, we hope to have a few minutes for Q&A. At that point, you can either still type your questions in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand and ask questions directly. As Karel just mentioned, the session is being recorded. And if you attend all the sessions today, you will be able to earn 3 PDHs. We will not be sending out any certificates, but we will keep, we do have the information from Zoom on the participants, so we will be saving that information in case of an audit. And Karel, he's sharing the agenda right now, and see we have a couple of breaks. We try to split it into 3 one-hour sessions. So with that, I want to thank all of our speakers today for sending us the abstracts and willing to present today. We really appreciate it. So our first presentation, as you can see on screen, is how IBR is centering equity. And IBR stands for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program, I-5, between the states of Washington and Oregon. And we have 2 speakers today who've been working for a while on equity, particularly on this project. So we have Janelle Bell. Janelle is the founder and president of Espousal Strategies, LLC, a boutique government, community, and public affairs firm focused on collaborative problem solving, equity and inclusion, issue lobbying, and coalition building. Janelle is a veteran government, public, and community affairs professional, having served in various public policy, community engagement, and senior level capacities over the last 16 years. He also served as Director of Diversity and Transit Equity for TriMet. Janelle is currently serving as the Principal Equity Officer for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Project. Thanks for being here today, Janelle. And we also have Jake War. Jake is the Director of Policy and Planning at Espousal Strategies. Jake is driven by the firm belief that accessible, reliable, convenient, and affordable transportation options are crucial for communities to thrive. To that end, his career has focused on the connections between transportation and social equity, with time spent in both the public and private sectors. Jake has a Master of Urban and Regional Planning from Portland State University and a Bachelor's of Sociology from the University of Utah. So welcome as well, Jake. Thank you both for speaking today. And go ahead, share your screen, the presentation.
All right, I'll take that over. All you, Janelle.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present this afternoon, and thank you in advance for the work you're doing to improve Oregon. We have an opportunity today to share a little bit about how we are really integrating or attempting to integrate equity into the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the IBR program, it's a program to replace the interstate bridge, which of course sits between both Oregon and Washington and is over 100 years old. Next slide, please. Start off with just a little bit of overview and kind of just paint the broad brush as to why are we integrating equity. We see equity as 4 tenets as to how we advance this program. We know that transportation projects, frankly, have excluded and are harmed Black, Indigenous, and people of color, often referred to as BIPOC communities, low-income neighborhoods, persons with disabilities, and other communities. We don't have to go very far to look for specific examples. For example, the Albina neighborhood, where I-5 tore through a bustling and thriving African-American community. We know that we have still today disparities in access to quality transportation options, which frankly impacts household costs, available job opportunities, access to healthcare and other services. And so the IBR program is really looking to provide opportunities for economic benefits for individuals and businesses at a historic disadvantage. The way in which we like to think about the program is, how do we go beyond mitigations? Oftentimes, the way in which equity, if considered at all, and infrastructure efforts is, we want to do X, Y, and Z. How do we mitigate its impacts on historically harmed communities? We have a different frame, which is, how do we leverage this for potentially $5 billion investment to historically uplift communities often left behind? How do we ensure that this investment creates new opportunities in workforce and economic development for communities often left behind? Next slide, please. So just kind of how we're centering equity. We started off with just really unpacking the history of I-5 corridor, and we'll go through some of these very specifics here in just a moment, but you can't really advance equity in any kind of infrastructure effort until you really know the history. And so Jake and I, we are consultants on the GEC side. The GEC is WSP. And so during the proposal phase as well as the pursuit phase, we advanced a notion of why not create a principal equity officer role for the program, the project. If we really want to center equity, how do we do it at the onset? And so that's an example of how even during the pursuit phase, you can really start to think and conceptualize how equity can show up. The client thought that was a good idea and thus created the principal equity officer. I serve as a principal equity officer and Jake is the equity lead. We created also an equity advisory group. The equity advisory group is a cross-section of both Oregon and Washington practitioners, some coming from community-based organizations, others coming from our regional peers. So we have, for example, City of Portland, City of Vancouver, both ports, both of the NPOs around the table. And so we've invited and they've agreed to send their equity staff to work with us, to wrestle with some of these concepts around a table. And the EAG is really there to help guide the program towards equitable processes and outcomes. We also have deployed a number of inclusive and intentional engagement strategies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, as well as beginning to think about how we're going to package and think through the procurement. So really being intentional in terms of the procurement and contracting. Jake has led a phenomenal effort to really demographic analyses to inform program design and strategies to further equity. He'll talk a little bit more about how that is showing up in this stage in the program. We've been intentional in terms of language and accessibility and inclusion. Incidentally, this corridor has a higher concentration of persons with disabilities than any other place in the region, in large part because the City of Vancouver has both the Washington State School for the Blind as well as the Washington State School for the Deaf. And so how we reach out to those communities and engage them in intentional, meaningful ways to bridge design, as to accessibility, all of these things are part and parcel to the work that we're trying to advance. And as I mentioned, being intentional in terms of accessibility and inclusion for persons with disabilities, we have on our EAG, for example, a member from the School for the Blind, as well as Disabilities Right Oregon, helping us ensure that we're being proactive. As well as DEI education and training for IBR program staff. We have a once a month lunch and learn where every month we tackle a topic relative to the DEI spectrum to really help to build up the culture and the capacity within the organization such that all of us are on this journey together. Next slide. Next slide. So just setting the context, as I indicated earlier, we understand that this corridor has a large and long history. And I'll just read a few of these. We know that indigenous peoples have lived in and traveled to the Portland, Vancouver region since time immemorial, including in the immediate vicinity of the current interstate bridge. White settlement disrupted tribal communities in the early 19th century, and the US government removed most indigenous peoples to reservations in the 1850s. This area along the Columbia River remains significant to indigenous today. And so, for example, in our community advisory group, we have both the Cowits as well as the Grand Ronde tribes. And, obviously in any federal project, you're required to go through a tribal consultation process. But again, if we're leading with equity, we realize that's not enough. And if we really want to be intentionally engaging all communities, especially our indigenous communities, then we have to go over and beyond. We also know that adjacent to the interstate bridge lies Vanport, the site of a World War II housing development that flooded in 1948, forcing residents, about a third of whom were Black, to evacuate and killing at least 15 that were noted. One of our co-chairs, Ed Washington of our community advisory group, actually lived in Vanport and still has those memories that he brings to his work with us. And as indicated earlier, the construction of the I-5 in the 1950s destroyed more than 1,000 homes in the Albina neighborhood of North Portland, just a few miles south of the interstate bridge. And the reason why that's important is as ODOT has been trying to advance the road border improvement program, it is still stuck in this very deep and troubled history. And that's kind of what's been impacting that project's ability of moving forward is because of this history. And so, how do you really integrate equity in a way that is restorative and intentional? And so how do you leverage significant investment to improve the Rose corridor, but also paying tribute and homage to the long history and leveraging those dollars in a way you can never repair, but you can hopefully lessen some of the pain and create new opportunities. So that's kind of the challenge in some of these projects. Next slide, please. I'll just talk real quickly about the population. One of the things that we do a fair amount of is looking at census data and just population growth. This is just sort of a snapshot of population by county in 2020. And you'll see how both Clark County as well as Washington County, how they continue to grow. We'll talk a little bit about now between 2010 and 2020, the changes. The region added over 274,000 residents from 2010 to 2020, which is a 30% increase. Most of this growth in the region was among people of color, increasing 49% over the past decade. The region went from 20% to 32% of the population comprised of people of color. Stunning in 10 years. And so that is a trend that will continue. And again, as we think about these projects prospectively, it's going to be critically important, both in terms of being good stewards of public resources, but also being able to design and engineer quality projects that serve all of our communities to really be intentional in terms of your equity framework and equity thinking. Next slide. Just real quickly, as we look at Clark County, we wanted to sort of unpack, and Jake's done a great job unpacking sort of where this demographic analysis is showing up in everyday life. And what's stunning about this is, again, from 2010 to 2020, the BIPOC population in Clark County increased from 78,000 to 138,000 people. Incidentally, and this is something I always like to mention, the city of Gresham, like the whole city of Gresham, is about, I think, 114,000 people total. And that's about the fourth largest city in the state of Oregon. So what this tells us is there are more people of color living in Clark County than the whole city of Gresham, which is our fourth largest city. And so the growth is phenomenal, and it's been interesting unpack in Clark County as we think about, for example, what does that mean in terms of high capacity transit? What does that mean in terms of who's going to access high capacity transit, so on and so forth, and having those conversations about access and all of those types of things has been really interesting. Which, by the way, this is a significant change since CRC. And so there's a strong argument, equity argument we've been making as to why it's important to replace the bridge, because we know through our own survey data that BIPOC communities are perhaps using the bridge much more frequently than their white counterparts. Because unfortunately, folks are moving, unfortunately or fortunately, unfortunately, they're being displaced, but folks are moving to Clark County in search of more affordable housing because they've been displaced from Portland Metro, Multnomah County, Washington County, but yet they're still traveling across the bridge for work and services. So they're in their car a lot more. Next slide, please. So a little about equity commitment. Next. And so we've been working and developing an equity framework. You might ask, what is a framework? Really, a framework is sort of like a blueprint. And so there are essentially 4 elements of the framework that we like to think of. One is the program equity definition, which is what does equity mean in the context of IBR? Measures of success, which is what do we want to measure and how will we measure it? We'll talk a little bit about some of these things. Equity objectives. For IBR, we've developed 6 equity objectives, which is what do we want to achieve and how do we know that we've actually achieved it? And then it's sort of the operational plan. How do you put all of these elements into action? Some of where that kind of emerges is around our community engagement tactics and techniques, our design elements, and then of course, all of this will show up in our construction specifications, the directions we give a prime contractor in terms of what we want to see in terms of workforce diversity, what we want to see in terms of contract participation and packaging, so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So as I indicated, we've worked closely with our equity advisory group to come up with an equity definition. And prior to coming up with a definition, we spent a fair amount of time assessing how our region was defining equity. And so we looked at our regional partners' equity definitions to really identify if we can come up with a synthesis. That then became the basis by which our equity advisory group began their work to develop a definition. And the reason why it's important for any program, particularly a program of this size, to come up with a project-specific definition for equity is because we want to make sure that everyone is singing from the same sheet of music. I could ask each of you how you define equity. I would bet my, I'd bet $100 that you'd each come up with a different definition. So we wanted to make sure we had shared understanding. So the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program defines equity in terms of both process and outcomes. Process equity means that the program prioritizes access, influence, and decision-making power for historically and presently disenfranchised communities throughout the program in establishing objectives, design, implementation, and evaluation of success. Outcome equity is a result of successful process equity and is demonstrated by tangible transportation and economic benefits for equity priority communities. Next slide. We go on to define the populations in terms of equity priority communities, which are defined as those who experience and or have experienced discrimination and exclusion based on identity or status, such as BIPOC, which of course is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, persons with disabilities, communities with limited English proficiency, also referred to as LEP communities, persons with lower incomes, also under environmental justice communities and protected from that perspective, houseless individuals and families, immigrants and refugees, young people, older adults. Together, process equity and outcome equity contribute to addressing the impacts of and removing longstanding injustices experienced by these communities. And the reason why it's important for us to point out this definition has become and will continue to become the basis by which we do all of our equity analyses, will be the basis for our community benefits agreement. And so this is the barometer by which we'll measure our success relative to these populations. Jake will talk later about some of the equity index work. This becomes the basis by which we develop an equity index and doing some of that mapping. Next slide, please. And my last slide, and then I'll turn over to Jake. is, as I indicated, we've developed 6 equity objectives. You'll recall that one of the elements of the framework are objectives. And so we have 6: mobility and accessibility, physical design, community benefits, economic opportunity, decision-making process, avoiding further harm, which of course you often see as sort of the mitigation side. And so under each of these objectives is how we implement our work. So I'll just choose one, for example, mobility and accessibility, where our objective there relative to our equity sort of benchmark is to ensure that we're improving mobility, accessibility, and connectivity, especially for lower income travelers, persons with disabilities, and historically underserved communities who experience transportation barriers. So that becomes a measure for our success. Our community benefits is for us to find opportunities for and implement local community improvements in addition to required mitigations, that we're not just stopping at mitigations. And that's so critical in terms of this work. It's real easy to just do the bare minimum, mitigation. But what we know is that mitigations do not actually propel benefits to the degree that they can when you're leveraging these types of resources. So with that, Jake, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Janelle. Hi, everybody. Happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So I'll continue on with, first of all, as Janelle mentioned in our equity framework, having a document and having that sort of foundation is nice, but what are we actually going to do? How are we going to put it into action? So a few examples that I'll share is how this framework feeds into and supports our development of screening criteria as we're looking at different design options for the project. The project includes, transit, it includes interchange construction, it includes replacing the bridge, of course, but it's a little bigger than that. And so there are a lot of elements that include a lot of design considerations. How do we screen for that through the lens of equity? And so we used our equity framework as a foundation for developing equity-specific screening criteria at the front end of the design process. We are working on developing performance measures for the longer term project to see how are we successful in terms of advancing equity, working towards our equity objectives. Janelle mentioned our community engagement approaches. We've learned a lot along the way. We knew that we needed to do a very large outreach effort throughout the course of this project. It's a very impactful project for the whole region. And so we knew we needed to have dedicate a lot of resources to it, but we needed to be flexible enough that we could respond to community feedback in, say, how we were maybe coming up short in reaching certain communities. So one example that we learned along the way was we looked at the different languages spoken in the immediate project area to inform our translation and interpretation needs. But there are limitations as far as what you can glean from the data, especially census data. I'm sure many of you know that. So we in talking actually to community members, like on our equity advisory group, we learned of a community, a Chuukese community in Vancouver, Washington. It's from a community from Micronesia. I actually wasn't even familiar with the Chuukese language. So we added that as a language and made a particular effort to engage those folks. So we just wanted to be adaptive to make sure that we're being inclusive and we're hearing from folks across the community. And then finally, accountability measures of our framework. It's supporting, again, not just being a document on the shelf, but something that has teeth, and that throughout the entire program, not just the equity team, the entire program is going to implement it and then report back on how it was implemented and incorporated. Janelle also talked about, gave a broad overview of the Equity Advisory Group, EAG, which was in addition to what was originally planned, just a community advisory group. A lot of projects have something similar to that. But we thought it was important to have an equity specific group to really laser focus in on equity issues. So we had 3 types of members that Janelle went over. including at-large community members who we appointed through an application process. And actually had a lot of applications, which not surprising for the Portland region, if you're familiar, that there's a lot of embracing of equity, and including transportation equity. But some really strong voices there, some great minds. This group provides recommendations directly to the top the top leader of the program administrator. So, for example, the equity definition and the screening criteria, those are recommendations that they've developed and provided. They're engaging on all elements of the modified, what we're calling the modified locally preferred alternative. For a bit of context real quick, this project sort of is a try again, almost a reboot, but I need to be careful about calling it that because we're trying to do things very differently. But about a decade ago and over the past couple decades, the region was aware that this bridge needed to be replaced. It's not seismically sound. It's not a modern and adequate bridge for our transportation needs. Because it was built, there's two bridges. One was built about 100 years ago. One was over 60 years ago. So this modified LPA, because there was a previous project, and if you're familiar with the federal process, there was a record of decision. The project fell apart kind of for political reasons. And so we're modifying, we had a place that we started from, and we're modifying that given changes in context. And so the EAG, this advisory group is engaging on all of those elements. And then a community benefits agreement that we are going to be developing to make sure that we've got these different commitments down on paper, and that they are, the program is held to them. They are integral to developing that, which is a process that we've begun. Real quickly, I kind of explained the screening process. But essentially the project team, beyond just the equity team, the whole consultant team developed some categories of screening that we're doing on different design options, and I won't read them there, but they're listed. And so then we went through as a group and said, okay, under each of these, first of all, what had the equity advisory group already said with respect to design that we could incorporate? And then where are there clear ties between different criteria and equity? What criteria support our equity objectives? What could more strongly support them? And really incorporating equity throughout that whole process and those criteria. So a few examples of that. So we included in there population from equity priority communities within close proximity of a high capacity transit station. That's something that's actually going to be applied a bit later in the project. We looking at, and I'll talk about this next, jobs and services accessible within certain travel times via transit and driving, which I'll quickly, as a side note, you know, there's certainly a lot of focus on folks who rely on transit and don't have other options, or many other options. But with the demographic changes that John L. talked about, people are being displaced from more inner neighborhoods of Portland where there is high quality transit service into areas that are farther out and requires them to drive because there's not the transit service that they might otherwise use. So you have certainly a lot of low income folks who would much rather take transit because it's more affordable, but are sort of forced into driving. So driving ends up being, and drive times and commuting in single occupancy vehicles does end up being an equity issue. Another example here is looking at proximity of pedestrian infrastructure to vehicle lanes, particularly when we're talking about blind or low vision pedestrians who rely on sound to navigate. That's a key issue for accessibility. And then available land from the different design options of what would be left and have potential to be developed for things like affordable housing or other community amenities that would be part of that community benefits agreement. As far as just as a quick example of something we're in the midst of now, is looking at different transit options, high capacity transit options for the project, and how they compare in terms of equitable outcomes in benefiting the communities that we're really focused on. So we are looking at different station locations and who lives near those stations. We're looking at how different options improve access to jobs and services for these communities. We're looking at particular neighborhoods, and I'll show you a map on the next slide, that our equity index identified as really being important to focus on from an equity perspective. And then potential property impacts of different transit alignments. Are there certain options that would displace folks more than others? Who are those folks, residential and businesses that would be displaced? And all of that feeds into screening and performance measures that are informing this whole process. So here I'm showing a map of our equity index. This was a tool we developed using the demographic data we have for the communities in our equity definition, and overlaid them in terms of concentrations, higher concentrations of each of these communities, to see where there's sort of that layering, that intersection between these communities. And this helped us identify, within our project area, where do those folks live, so that we're focusing engagement efforts, so that we're seeing who benefits from the program. And a couple areas stood out. So if I'm showing here the Columbia River, which divides Oregon and Washington. You've heard us, if you're not familiar, we've heard us talk about Vancouver. It's Vancouver, Washington, not BC. So showing that there is transit, the vine here, which is C-Tran, that's the Southwest Washington transit provider. That's a BRT line, Bus Rapid Transit, that does currently serve this area in darker green generally, that stands out from an equity perspective, looking at the data. And it goes into downtown Vancouver, Washington here, that's a little darker in that it has a lot of these communities, higher concentrations of these communities. So this helps inform where our focus is. That said, there are people from these equity priority communities living everywhere, whether it's concentration, high concentrations or not. So this is not comprehensive in terms of everyone we're considering and everything that we're looking at, but it's a general way to guide some of our thinking. Another example, I'll just explain real quick of something that we're doing in looking at how we analyze access to jobs and services, and say how different transit options would impact that access. There's a methodology that if you're familiar at all with Transit Center, got to give credit to them, because they developed this methodology where you can look at sort of what the average person from certain communities has access to from certain locations. So this map is showing where we started in looking at our different high capacity transit options for this project, with a baseline of looking at what we modeled jobs for 2045 and the projected transit network for 2045 based on plans and anticipated investments here. So the darker areas indicate areas where if you started your trip there, the darker it is, the more jobs you can actually reach from that location via transit, in this case in 45 minutes during the midday. So we use this as a baseline. If for some reason it ended up being or just as a no build. I mean, that's obviously a pretty common baseline to use. And said, all right, investment option A, how much would that improve access for, let's say, for people of color? How much would that improve access for the average low-income resident of that area? And the dirty details of what's behind that analysis, I can't really go through here, but it's based on where folks live and where they're distributed in the region. You can look at it for the average region resident. You could look at it for the average resident of the city of Vancouver. You could look at it for the average resident of our program area for one of those equity priority areas or neighborhoods. And that way you can really analyze and compare who's benefiting and how much from these different options. So just wanted to share that a little bit as we're certainly in the midst of this right now. A lot going on in our project, but gives it kind of an overview of how we're really trying to stay true to this commitment to equity and make it a real impactful project for the communities that we're paying the most attention to from an equity perspective. That, I think we're happy to take any questions that folks have. Unless, John L., you wanted to add anything else for the time being?
Oh, I think that's great. Yeah, happy to.
Thank you, Jake and Janelle. So you can either raise your hand or feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you may have to Janelle and Jake. Janelle, I guess I have a question while waiting. So you've also worked on the Rose Quarter project with equity. So last year we had, for this workshop, we had a panel discussion on transportation equity, what it is, why it's important. And that meeting and a couple of other meetings that I've attended when it comes to transportation equity is, like most of us here are engineers, planners, is what can we do like right now? Like how do we, like we're at different stages of our projects. There are different kind of there are different projects that we all work on. But I guess one question is all like, what can we do right now? How do we know if our project is equitable, and what do we do about it right now? So do you have any, I know you worked on multiple projects right now, and I know we had this question even within the IBR, you see from the engineer standpoint, is like, where do we come in as engineers to affect that equity portion in our project?
That's a great question, and I'd love for Jake to chime in here as well. Part of that is, I think, by employing some of the tools that we are on IBR, understanding where populations, priority populations, equity priority populations are relative to potential infrastructure investments. Ultimately, good engineering and good planning serves everyone. And to the degree that you're posing questions as to who's going to be served by this project, and have we considered the perspectives of folks historically not engaged as an engineer, that's critically important. I mean, oftentimes engineers in these programs have more influence than anyone. And so it's really important for engineers as well as planners as a field, a community of practice, to really start to think about how do you begin to integrate and adopt sort of equity lens type of thinking. So that's number one, I think I'll mention. The secondly is really deploying things like where we can, and we're doing this as Jake indicated on IBR, we can really identify which communities might positively and or negatively be impacted by a potential transit alignment or potential pedestrian access. All those types of things I think are critical. So those are some thoughts. And as you know, I will say the region is certainly wrestling with these concepts. There's I think we're all kind of figuring out how to do this together. the first thing that Jake and I did was look at other mega projects across the nation, and we could not find an example of where equity was really being integrated. So we're on the cutting edge here as a region, really identifying how do you proactively have these conversations. And, I will say it's not been easy. I mean, we've been in some really difficult conversations, especially with some of our partners, because this is new language for them as well, and new considerations. And everyone likes to say they want equitable outcomes, but it's not until the rubber meets the road and you really start to unpack some of these things, because ultimately equity is going to mean that you're investing in other areas and perhaps not in other areas. So it's a journey from that perspective. But Jake, what else would you like to add?
You definitely, yeah, hard to add much to that. I would just say, approaching equity with humility is key. I mean, I know we're all figuring it out. I know myself, you may have noticed I'm a white guy, and a lot of privilege there. And I make mistakes all the time, and try to learn and do the work to learn from communities who are more impacted, who are more underserved, and have been marginalized. I think that's key as far as your intent, but then intent is obviously not enough, because you're going to have, and there have historically been, a lot of negative impacts with the best of intentions. So thinking through that lens of, all right, maybe I came up with this solution in a very neutral way, just looking at the data or the technical data and analysis. But did I think about the human impact? Did I think about who maybe wasn't considered through this analysis and how they might be impacted? I think that's, if you can kind of keep that at the back of your brain whenever you're on a project, I think that's critical. And then just talking to the community, because that in terms of process, we talk about process and outcomes, that process, even if things in a project don't end up exactly how a certain community wants it, or it doesn't end up being the best solution, given other considerations besides equity, still the community wants to be involved, and folks are smart. They can understand if a decision was made that kind of runs against what their input says. They want to know either way, and just hear why a decision was made, so that they're at the table and at least participating. But then ideally, of course, they are also the ones who benefit, and things are done in a way that's different than how, say, the interstate highway system was built in the 50s and 60s.
Lovely. Thank you both for that. And also one of the questions that came up was, I think, asking for case studies the winter workshop, as well as other ITE meetings. So hopefully people can take back some ideas of what was done on this project to apply to their projects too. There is a question in the chat. Caleb asked, were there other mobility services other than transit considered with IBR equity in mind? Carpool, van pool, shared use mobility, demand responsive transit or paratransit?
I think I can speak to that a little. So at this stage of the project, because it's so early, we aren't even at the environmental analysis stage. And so we're looking at engineering and design, real engineering design starting maybe next year at the earliest, construction, maybe breaking ground in 2025. So this project has a ways to go. And I would say directly for what we are considering now, those are outside of the current realm of focus. But in terms of working with all of our partners, the transit agencies, the cities, the counties, there are going to be solutions and strategies to address where this project can't meet certain needs and can't provide as comprehensive of service as a lot of those services that you mentioned can. So maybe in the community benefits agreement that we develop, there could be some of those elements. I know that our transit partners want to make sure that this new high capacity transit option is successful, and that requires a lot of other mobility strategies, of course. So I would say that's absolutely key to consider, and will be something down the road. But I like that you flagged that now, because it's important to be thinking about along the way.
Thank you. Anything to add, Janelle? I guess
We covered it.
I also want to say the bike sharing, bike itself, etc. Active transportation is definitely part of every option that the program is looking at. But the details, like Jake mentioned, probably wouldn't be coming in until later, until we get into design for the program. Anybody else have any questions? Those are all the questions that we had here. It's been a quiet group. We had a lot more questions last year on this project, on this topic.
Well, I've got a question while we're waiting, if you guys don't mind. So I'm kind of curious to hear more about the group's strategies for engaging community-based organizations. And I guess my question is maybe 3 parts. What's kind of the process for finding those CBOs? How do you guys incentivize them to be engaged? And how do you deal with mistrust from the community?
That is a great question. And one of the bright spots, I think, for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program is how we've really worked to advance intentional community engagement. So there are a couple of things that we have really been doing. One of which is, in addition to a standard that you would see as sort of a standard community engagement plan in most projects, we've developed an equity-specific community engagement strategy and plan. Really reaching out to community-based organizations, really reaching out to culturally specific organizations to engage early and often. And so we did this first when we stood up our community advisory group, as well as our equity advisory group. As I indicated earlier, we have both community-based representation, like Coalition of Communities of Color, which is here in Oregon, or NAACP or Latino Network. We have these groups represented on both our community advisory group as well as our equity advisory group. So that was one thing, to make sure that folks are really under the tent with us. Secondly, is we know that for many of our communities, these projects are barriers to engaging for a variety of reasons. And so we created what we call a low barrier mini grant program where we have awarded small grants to community-based organizations to meaningfully engage us. And so we give them a grant to help supplant the resources that it takes for them to engage their communities on topics that are important to the program. So for example, we did this with some of our engagement relative to design options, relative to high capacity transit options, to augment our broader engagement strategy. So that was really, really effective. The third thing we did was we went beyond what would be standard kind of requirement for LEP. Now, what's interesting thing about this project is you have 2 dots and 2 transit agencies, and they all each have their own LEP plan. And so we took a look at all of that, but we created a specific LEP strategy and plan for this project. As Jake indicated, part of doing the analysis, we realized that we had a large Chuukese population. And so that's one of the languages that we actually translate in. So I think there are 10 languages that we're translating in. We also have conducted intentional, curated, specific listening sessions in many of those languages. So we did a listening session, for example, in Russian-speaking communities. We did one in Mandarin, so on and so forth. Some of our top languages, we did listening sessions that were in those native tongues. So those are some of the elements that we've been implementing, and the results have just been phenomenal, and has really been a bright spot for us. Jake, anything else to add?
Just on the piece of your question about addressing trust deficits, because that's a solid point. I mean, especially with departments of transportation, given the history with public agencies generally. So I don't think we've solved that puzzle by any means. I think we've in providing actual resources, in respecting folks' time on our advisory groups for community members, we do provide stipends. But as far as the organizations themselves, you know, we are in recruiting them to join. A lot of them said, you know, well, are you just having us on the committee for the sake of saying, you know, okay, we've got NAACP on board. And we've had folks really challenge us to say, like, if I'm going to participate, it has to be clear how we're impacting decisions, and we need to see those results. So as we've tried to be as transparent as possible, respond directly to feedback that we get and say, this is how you've impacted things, or maybe this is why we weren't able to incorporate this recommendation. Those are a few things off the top of my head, but it's an ongoing process, no doubt.
Thank you. I had a question on one of the things you mentioned is what you mentioned DEI training for the staff, for the internal staff. I guess my question is, like, how did that come about, and how is that impacting the equity work, like the affecting the equity work so far?
Yeah, it's another example of something that we recommended during the pursuit, because it's a recognition and a realization that equity cannot be managed by a Jake and a John L. If we're really going to advance equity, it has to be part of everyone's job. And in order to do that effectively, we have to acknowledge that we're all on this journey together. And that journey requires, like you all are doing today, ongoing sort of professional development and capacity building. And so as a community of practice, as a project team, we thought it was really important at the onset to really begin to help build capacity, to build understanding of language and concepts within the team, such that folks can at least be a little bit more comfortable, as well as have a little bit more expertise as they work within their principal areas to advance equity. So how that sort of is operationalized, for example, is once a month we have a lunch and learn, where each month we have a specific topic relative to DEI. And we have a presenter or a panel. For example, we were able to invite some of the recipients of our mini grants to come to one of our lunch and learn and to have a panel discussion about what they were learning out in the community about the program and concerns they had. And then we were able to have project staff and consultants pose questions to them. So those are kind of some of the things that we're working to do to build internally a culture focused on equity and inclusion.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any more questions. So I guess we can take a break early, Cadell. That should be okay. So, well, thank you, Janelle and Jake, again for the great presentation and for answering our questions. It's great having you here.
Thank you for the invitation. Have a great rest of your training.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right. So we're doing a 15-minute break?
I think so. That sounds about right. So everyone, please join us back at 2:10 p.m. for our next set of presentations.
Would we like our presenters to join a couple of minutes early so we can test out the...
Sure. Yeah, Matt and Sean, if you guys could join a few minutes early, that'd be good.
Cool.
Hey, Sean, it looks like you might be back if you want to test the screen share.
I'm back too.
And Matt.
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's see. Let me know if that's coming through.
Yep.
You can hear me okay?
Can you go to the presentation mode though? That sometimes shows up on a different screen. Yep, you can see it.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
Good. And I think I'm just going to forward slides. So Matt, once we get to your part of the presentation, just let me know when you want me to go next, and I'll push us through. Okay.
Sounds good.
Right on. I like the winter workshop backgrounds. They're very fitting.
Thanks.
That was all Shilpa. She sent it over to me.
Put
That's
something together last year, so I figured we used it. Yeah.
Although it's not
Awesome.
even close to snowing today. We've got the snowflake there. It's beautiful blue skies.
Oh, not here. I mean, it's not snowing.
really?
But I don't see any blue skies over here. I'm glad it's not snowing. Done with winter.
So what's the odds that next year's winter workshop's in person?
I really hope it's 100%. I really hope it's in person.
I don't know. It could be in the metaverse. We'll see.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
We can wear our VR goggles and join in the metaverse. Tips,
Jeez.
digital currencies. It'll be fun. No, I'm with you, Shilpa. I'm very eager to get back to in person. These events are great, and it's really nice to have the information transfer, but it's just really hard to replicate the hallway
Yeah,
conversations and catching up with people.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All
this
right.
thing. Yeah, oh yeah, you're at time.
Yeah. 2:10. So hopefully people are back. Hopefully some people went outside to catch some of that sunshine, or it sounds like not all of the region is in sunshine, but we'll go ahead and start the next session, and I'll introduce our two speakers here. So we've got Sean Quayle. Sean is a senior traffic engineer with Washington County. He oversees the traffic signals group, managing over 350 traffic signals, as well as numerous ITS devices. Sean enjoys focusing on emerging technologies and treatments to enhance safety and mobility. And examples of that include adaptive signal control, smart pedestrian treatment, conditional red clearance extension, and transit truck priority. And we've also got Matt Dorado. Matt is a graduate of Portland State University, where he was an undergraduate researcher with Dr. Bertini's ITS lab. He has 17 years of experience in transportation, 10 years in the private sector with Group McKinsey, and 7 years in the public sector, 5 of those with Clark County and the last 2 with Washington County. His experience has mostly been in traffic operations and what traffic does when the signal indications change. The last 2 years have been spent learning what it takes to change those signal indications. And as some of you may know, Matt in his off time is also a husband, father, and as you may tell from his background, a guitarist in 2 local original bands that play around the Western US. Wow. Well, with that, I'll turn the floor over to the 2 of you.
Sounds good. Thank you for that intro, Cadell. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Cadell, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Excellent. Good deal. So we're going to try to, I've got my timer going here. I was looking at our slide deck yesterday. Matt and I kind of pulled together these pieces. So I'm going to present first on kind of our left turn near miss analysis that we did with Matt's help, and then also Chase Hildner over at DKS. He was our intern this past summer. So want to give him a lot of credit. He did a lot of the heavy lifting on some of the technical analysis and the statistics, and I get the fun part of presenting the big picture to you guys. And then Matt's going to talk about red light running analysis and how we use some of this video trajectory analytic data to make sense of how to interpret and what's useful for different applications. So we're going to talk about two of those. We're trying to get through it fairly quickly, so I apologize if I talk kind of quick, but I think we've got about 45 minutes worth of slides, and I'm going to try to get down to at least 20 if I can. So big picture, we're trying to get through what constitutes a near miss. So you might have heard this term, different vendors talking about it, big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning. The reality is you still got to look at the data, and you still got to have common sets of definitions like we heard in the previous presentation, so that we can be talking from the same page and comparing apples to apples. And then for this use case, we looked at 14 intersections across Washington County, kind of our higher crash locations. And when we're looking at these data sets spatially, not only from a temporal standpoint, but spatially across the county, how do we normalize so that we can do that fair comparison of these results and do some sort of relative metrics? And then we wanted to ask the question of, okay, well, we've got some near miss information related to left turn crashes at intersections. How do these relate to our reported crashes? We'd expect a fairly strong correlation between the two, but we didn't know for sure. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then talk about how we're using some of the data to identify some lower hanging fruit for safety treatments and some future research needs. So the tool that we used for this analysis in Washington County is Street Simplified. And that's a whole different presentation about their tool set. I'm going to skip to the kind of the meat of this, which is they have some assumptions that they've made when they deliver the data to their clients as far as kind of what constitutes near miss. So what they're assuming, at least as a default, is all movements, all roadway users, all types get counted, all the different speeds get counted, and then all of the severities that they use as their metric, but also post encroachment time. That's what this PET is, that's circled. And they're making the assumption that, at least out of the box, everything that's 5 seconds or less as a post encroachment time is called a near miss by them. Watching the videos and looking at it with some engineering judgment, a good portion of these events are not necessarily high risk or even what I would call near miss. So what we focused on in our analysis was looking at, for left turns, those vehicles that turn in front of oncoming traffic. So again, order is mattering. So if somebody's kind of aggressive as a sneaker and they go right after the vehicle that's oncoming goes through the intersection, that's not as big of a deal as someone that is turning in front of oncoming traffic. That is much more likely to generate a crash, or in our opinion, a near miss. So we have the ability, at least within this software platform, to filter that by motion first for roadway user 1 left, and then roadway user 2 setting it up as motion through, and then running a query on the results to look at that. And then we also used the post encroachment time threshold. So we subjectively set that at 3 seconds. That's based on watching some videos and knowing that we only have 1 day or 2 days, or in some cases 3 days worth of data at each intersection. The vast majority are 1 to 2 days. So we don't have a ton of data over time. So we're trying to infer some information from relatively limited sample sizing. And for that reason, we went ahead with something that's a little bit longer of a post encroachment time than what we otherwise might use. So we ended up using 3 seconds. I would submit that something probably closer to 2.5 or 2 seconds are really those higher risk type events. But using that 3 second threshold allows us at least to have something consistent between the intersections to look at, and allows us enough data to do some analysis. So have reached out to our friends up at City of Bellevue. They've done a citywide near miss analysis using a different software platform And it was good to see that the assumptions that we had made fit with some of the literature and detailed research that City of Bellevue did. So again, this is kind of the safety pyramid network. It's looking at thresholds for post-encroachment time. And under 2 seconds is that critical conflict. They found that about 1.4% of the events that were recorded fell into that. And then the minor conflicts of 2 to 3 seconds, they found just under 5% of the events fall into that category. So something around 6% of their events were falling into that threshold. I think our values were a little bit less than that, but I'd have to go back and look at the data. So again, those were the near miss thresholds that we used: turning in front of oncoming traffic, and then a P time less than 3 seconds. And what we saw in looking at some of the data is that no two events are the same. Context really matters. And so you got to watch the videos, particularly for these higher risk events. But the nice thing is that as you use these thresholds of lower post-encroachment time and constraining that movement order, you exponentially reduce the number of events and videos that you have to watch. So that's a good thing. That makes it a little easier to look at the context around each event. But it is interesting to see the different modal users at the intersection and the context for the traffic signal phasing and what's going on as the events happen. And then, at least for Street Simplified, they stratify the data into these near miss versus speeding versus red light running versus blocking versus jaywalking events. So you've got to watch not just the near miss events, you want to look at the other high risk events too, to get a better picture of kind of the high risk behavior that's happening at the intersections. So in this case, this still is showing somebody that's running a red light on the left turn that typically runs with a flashing yellow arrow, but we use conditional phasing so that that flashing yellow arrow won't turn on unless a sufficient gap in traffic is detected. We as engineers think that signs and striping and signals are going to work really well, and for the most part they do work really well, but it's not going to catch everybody. And so understanding human factors and driver behavior is really important when looking at these near miss observations. Let's see, kind of a summary of kind of the future research that we wanted to highlight. So you know, we think that there's going to be more research needed on these normalization methodologies, as I'll talk about. We eventually want to expand the analysis period. So the 1 to 3 day evaluations were a great start. But we really want to get to that kind of 30 event threshold that allows us to do some statistical analysis with a little bit more confidence. Only 3 of those 14 intersections had 30 events that fell into that high risk category. So I guess that's a good thing at some level, that we're not seeing overwhelming high risk event occurrences. But I think looking at this at a more longer duration is going to give us more information to make more confident decisions about how we want to use this tool and how we want to frame our safety program around this tool. I already talked about some of the medium low risk events. And then we want to work with vendors to try to define the automation and risk scoring methods that we want to use. And this is, I think, an area of need within the industry, is as we get more information from these big data sets, coming up with some agreement on what's categories for high, medium, and low risk events. So yeah, the other piece that we looked at was comparing crashes to near miss events. The challenge here is, again, we were looking at very low trend data for the Street Simplified data, again, 1 to 3 days. And then we compared that versus the 3 most recent years of left turn related crashes, so 2017 to 2019. So we've got a mismatch already in the dates and the scale with which we're analyzing this data. So we want to just throw that out there. But we still went ahead and did the comparison, trying to isolate for as best we can. And the isolation is really around normalization for near misses. We looked at it based on just using time So trying to make sure that the time periods overlapped for our intersections. And then we looked at a time and volume-based normalization, where we started to look at a combination of the two. And so, for example, here, this is showing on the left-hand side here, near miss analysis for the left turns. We've ranked this based on the weekday rate and looking at the rate of near miss occurrences, again, normalized by time. So this shows kind of a ranking based on the intersections on the left-hand side. You can see the type of left turn as that second column, and then the next two columns over are weekday and weekend occurrences and rates. So we tried to split that out because not all of our locations had weekend information. So that's why you see an NA there for some of these locations. But where we did have weekend data, we tried to show that in comparison. And then the near miss time and volume base. So this is a different normalization methodology, again, isolating to about thousands in ADT. And this looks at the differences between rankings. So you can kind of see them side by side. And we've tried to use color coding to show gradation there. But again, the near miss rates are interesting. You can glean some information off of weekday versus weekend, and then the different normalization methods. They produce similar results, not the same, but similar results comparing the two. Then if you look at this table 3 in our report, which looked at crash rates versus our near miss rates. So we held the crash rate and sorted by crash rate, and then we looked at near miss normalizations. And what this is showing us is not a great correlation. We went through and did a little bit of statistical analysis on the actual correlation coefficient. So something that is a 1 or -1 is a perfect fit, and 0 means no relationship between the data sets. And so time-based and the time and volume-based normalization results weren't a great fit for crash rates versus near misses. The two normalization rates have a pretty close fit, which is good. That's what we would expect. But the crash rates do not match up very well, at least in this first pass at looking at 14 intersections here in Washington County for left turn related crashes. But not all is lost. We went through and still looked at the videos. We made some judgments around which locations were the most egregious and where we could actually do some things. So you see rank number 5 here, this westbound on 12th and Sherwood at Oregon Street. We've actually explored turning off the flashing arrow. In the meantime, we've actually made the flashing arrow harder to turn on. So there's a number of different things that we've done to try to take the data and think through low-hanging and higher cost treatments. So, from a signal timing perspective, we want to upgrade our controller so we have higher resolution logging. We want to look at modifying those left turn parameters. So again, that's make it harder for that flashing arrow to turn on. And then also making sure that we've got some of the different tools in our toolbox for separating conflicts between pedestrians and left turning traffic, and reducing pedestrian delay at some of our intersections. And then the heavier handed option is to actually turn off the flashing yellow arrow or the permissive left turn by time of day, which we've done at 2 of our highest crash locations at the county. The other options that are out there are limiting movements, increasing signal spacing, modifying the green time and clearance intervals, and then looking for ways to improve sight distance or adding warning signs, striping, other things that are more traditional. So again, just to reiterate, the research needs regarding near miss is we need a consistent definition of what a near miss event is. We need to, as an industry, think through what those minimum samples are to reliably gauge near miss events and kind of the time period of video that we might need to produce those number of samples of higher risk near miss events, because it'll inform scoping for projects. And then I think we need more research on normalization methodologies and kind of looking at what's reasonable to expect for the fit between crash data and these near miss events. And then obviously we want to automate a lot of this process. So in conclusion, the NIRMIS data is useful, at least as a starting point for augmenting some of the crash data. There's not a great fit between the two, but I think it's useful in augmenting and trying to be proactive in managing safety and conflicts at our intersections. Just understanding that that subjective versus objective is still out there. And as an industry, we want to try to at least be transparent when we're making a subjective claim. And just note that this comparative analysis appears based on my conversations and interactions with folks in the industry and talking to some of the vendors. It seems to be in its infancy. I think a lot of the vendors are trying to build tools around what we want. But as a community, we need to have a clear definition of what's going to be useful to us so that we can define how we want vendors to set up these tools to automate. And yeah, I think the video really helps tell the story. So it's really important to have that video to see the context. So I'm going to hand it off to Matt here. Matt, you're up.
Okay, red light running. I'll probably talk a little bit faster than Sean. Seems like we're running up against it. So anyway, we're trying to look at the red light running and if there's ways to mitigate it. And so in order to find a possible solution, we had to kind of identify the cause or causes of whatever our perceived problem was. So we got the street simplified data, and we were trying to determine, if the data could answer some of our questions. And it allowed us to see how often, how fast, how long after the red indication was presented do drivers enter the intersection, when during the day do the events occur, and if the events are a function of the roadway volume. This also gave us an opportunity to do some QA/QC on the street simplified algorithms, although we're only able to determine if the algorithm correctly categorized the event, not whether or not the algorithm caught all the events. Next. Here's a quick example of what you see when you look at the video from Street Simplified. And you can see it shows you the indications and the trajectories of the car. And so here comes our red light runner. And we could probably skip the next one just for time. It's just another example. Probably go to the next slide after that. And so I had 13 high crash locations because one of the ones that Sean looked at was a non-signalized intersection. And so it gave us about 27 days of data. And so what they have is they have video record 2 cameras at the intersection, and then they process the data to determine the vehicle pedestrian volumes, near misses, red light running, and other metrics. For this analysis, we looked at red light running for the through movements only. And that gave us about 750,000 entering vehicles to look at. The red light running was defined as a vehicle passing the upstream crosswalk line after the red indication was presented. Next slide. So we have our probable causes, and we figured there was about 5 basic reasons why you would run a red light. First would be an emergency vehicle, like fire, police, or ambulances. So for this analysis, we took those out. Second would be kind of a blatant disregard for the red indication, or maybe a distracted driver. We expected those would occur late into the red time. Third would be if there was congestion downstream and the driver doesn't want to wait through another cycle, so they kind of sneak across. The next would be a late night low volume occurrence, when you kind of pull up to a red light, kind of assess it, and then see that there's no one coming, and then you go ahead and go through the intersection. Lastly, we have drivers that determine there's enough amber or yellow time for them to get through the intersection before the red indication, or have determined that they don't have the ability to stop safely. And so we're working with Street Simplified to get a report also that will allow us to see, it gives a couple different speed points, one at the beginning and one at the stop bar, so we can tell our people, speeding up or slowing down as they come into the intersection. And then after filtering out all the emergency vehicles, the events that were logged incorrectly by the algorithm, be it a bike or a wide turning truck or a train, we tossed those out. So we had about 335 separate events. Next. So this chart presents the number of events that had a vehicle traveling over the posted speed limit. So out of the 335 events, we had 107, or about a third of the events had a vehicle that was going at an average speed over the posted speed. As you can see in the chart, about half of those vehicles are just over the speed limit, about the 0 to 5 bin. And this really surprised us. So we expected the speeds to be much higher and a higher occurrence. Next. So here are the ones that occurred that were lower than the posted speed. And again, surprising, of the 335, there were 228 events that had the vehicle under, and about 3/4 of those vehicles were in the first 3 bins between 0 and 15 miles an hour under the speed limit. Next. So the next one we looked at was kind of how long into the red people were running the red lights. And we used 6 seconds as kind of our threshold. And that was chosen because at about 60 miles an hour, you'd be about 500 feet upstream from the signal, or at about the limit of our advanced detection. And so this chart shows that about 75% of the events happened in the first second after the red indication was presented. Next.
Hey, Matt, I have a question here. So, well, it's notable to see the proportions. That 1% that's happening 5 seconds to 6 seconds is really significant for application that we're going to talk about later with this clearance extension. I mean, those situations where you've got somebody entering 3 seconds or more into the intersection are our high risk type events where without other treatments, the signal is going to go, at least in Washington County, is going to go to a conflicting movement after the 1 second of all red. So those 0 to 1 second are covered at some level by the red clearance that's normally at an intersection at our signal timing. But anything that's more than that 1 second, that means somebody's entering while we're showing a conflicting movement, green or walks indication. So just something to think about as you're looking at the status set. It's interesting to see the proportions and how they break down. But 1% of a relatively small sample size is still noteworthy and of concern for us as we look at this.
And so since most of those occurred in the first second, I broke those down into 1/10 of a second, and it's a pretty solid linear distribution all the way down through that first second. Next. So then we looked at the time of day to see if there was, happening at certain times. And what you see here is a plot for a 24-hour period of all the events, and it looks pretty much like a roadway volume plot with peaks in the morning, midday, and in the PM. So nothing super surprising there. Next. And so then we looked at kind of the frequency. And so we wanted to see if there's a correlation between the roadway volume and the number of events. And so we used the volume data that was collected by Street Simplified to determine the volume for each intersection approach, then divided that by the number of events by approach. And it's kind of gave us a percentage of the entering vehicles that ran the red light, but that number was kind of not really intuitive. So I figured we'll look at it kind of like a 1 over volume. And so this shows the bins that we put the data in. And so we basically took the average of the roadway volume in the bin, and then the average of the percent for those bins, and divided those through to get kind of the average of the percent by traffic. And so like for the 10K, it was a 0.9%, which again isn't very intuitive. So basing it on the volume, you basically have 1 out of every 1,100 or 11,000 vehicles would run the red light, and they get progressively more frequent as you go down in the volume of the roadway. Next.
Yeah, and that makes some sense, Matt, because regardless of volume, some things that we should probably look at are isolating for number of cycle lengths and a number of cycles. There's a number of times that the red is shown as that exposure rate to the potential for red light running event, but yes, that makes sense.
And so the other thing we were looking at was kind of like the software accuracy. And so we figured that you still have to look at all the videos because at this time, the software can't determine between a train or a bike or a vehicle. And so it gets, some of those get picked up, like in this screen capture here where the bike went through. And so and there's also with the wide trucks that make a wide left-hand turn, we get picked up also. And so we had to, watch the video in order to determine what those were.
Yeah, and that's specific to red light running, the filtering that they're doing for that portion of the algorithm. They do count, try to split out by so that's kind of a separate module that Street Simplify does. But yes, good point, Matt. You saw a number of those wide turning trucks that got called red light running when they were really just going green on their left turn.
Right, but overall, the software did a really good job of discerning which ones were and which ones weren't running the red lights. So the kind of what we came to conclusion was that most of them happen shortly into the red, and there's a small percentage that possibly some red light red clearance extension could help. And of course we need to look at more data since we didn't have as much data as we would like. I'm all done.
Further research is always needed. So I think we had about a half an hour and we're probably right at that point. So I don't know, Cadell, if you want us to take a few questions now, or if you want us to wait to the end of the session.
Yeah, well, first, great presentation. It's always interesting to see kind of the innovation and creativity with all this new video data. I think we could maybe spend 5 minutes taking a question or two if there are any in the chat. If you have a question, go ahead and post it in the chat or raise your hand and I can unmute you. While we're waiting, I'll just ask, it's interesting to see, it looks like these are kind of predictive programs. So I'm kind of interested about if there are any concerns over liability when we're talking about changing signal indication based off of a predictive program.
Yeah, no, it's something that we as engineers and planners need to think through as far as putting everybody in a good place to have reasonably safe outcomes. We want to be proactive. And so the nice thing with this is you've got some sound data and you've got some video evidence, especially if as an agency, you can define what you're going to call a higher risk event and you can document it, then we feel a lot more confident that, in select locations, we're actually deviating from our normal guidance for signal timing by adding extra red time where we feel like the risk is high and the events are going on there. But we also want to look not only at just changing the red time, we want to look at what's kind of the underlying cause. Is it speed? Is it sight distance? Do we need to augment with lighting or signage? Things like that as well. But, this has been really useful for us. At one location that you see here, this is the entrance to St. Vincent's Regional Hospital here on the west side of Portland. And so they have, and it's the entrance to the emergency section of the hospital. So they have a higher proportion of red light running that happens here. What's interesting is there's a fair amount of red light running that was happening coming down the hill, kind of from left to right in this picture. And so what we did is we worked with our maintenance crew to go out there and add reflective tape basically to each of the back plates to accomplish kind of reflective back plates. We added a supplementary near side signal head because there's a curve actually to the left-hand side here to improve sight distance for vehicles as they approach, to try to make it easier for them to see the traffic signal. There is another signal further down here, probably 500 to 1,000 feet downstream. That's an ODOT signal that's actually in the line of sight if you look at the grade and go out there and look at it. So, I mean, what's helpful with those big data sets is helping us as engineers and planners narrow down what we really need to pay attention to. And then once you've isolated, there's some risk here to go out there and look at it and spend a little bit of time digging into it further. So it's not just as simple as we'll just change the signal timing. There's oftentimes more things we want to try to do to address things.
Yeah, I think the liability thing is if we were making it less safe, it'd be one thing, but we're adding kind of adding more red clearance, or we're kind of adding to the safety of it. So I think that's, a consideration that, we're not saying, oh, well, if we don't see anything, we're going to take away the red clearance or something like that. And, the examples too, as far as other things you can do, is we had at Tualatin, Sherwood, and Boones Ferry, down in Tualatin, there was a high number of people that were running the red light behind the trucks because there's a lot of truck traffic on there. And so it's like, okay, so, do we need to add a supplemental head somewhere outside the cone? People are following too close, they can't see the signal. And so, can we add something there to kind of help them know that the light is turning red? And so it's, just trying to look at different options.
Got it. Very interesting stuff. Well, thank you, Sean and Matt. And it looks like Michael had a question, but it sounds like it was answered by some of Sean's comments. And Ayana, I see your question, but for time's sake, we're going to go ahead and move on. And hopefully we can get to your question at the end of the session. So thanks again, Sean and Matt. David, if you wouldn't mind, David is our next presenter. If you wouldn't mind sharing your screen and making sure that all works.
Is the screen share working?
I do not see your screen yet.
Okay, how's that?
Yep, I see half your desktop and
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you see redefining traffic adhering to encourage new housing in the Silver State?
yes.
All right, looks like we are good to go then.
Perfect. Well,
Okay.
I'll introduce you really quickly, David, and then we'll get going. So David holds an engineering science degree from the Pacific Lutheran University and a civil engineering degree from Cal Poly SLO. Throughout his career, he has expressed a passion for high-speed rail and related traffic engineering innovations, and has written over 200 articles that were published in the Southern California section newsletter. He's grateful for the Oregon section for publishing his article on San Jose Mayor Sam Liccardo, calling on engineers to address housing equity and climate change in September of 2019. He is currently working for Phelps Engineering Services on land development projects throughout Western Nevada through the lens of traffic engineering. Really happy to have you here, David.
Thank you.
With that, I'll give the floor to you.
Great, thank you. All right, so who remembers this event? This was back in Portland in 2004. I was there. And what was such a highlight to me was seeing all that brand new residential construction in downtown Portland. It's something that Nevada, certain parts of Nevada are doing a bit better than other parts, but let's talk housing and technology. First off, before we get started, Oregon is a great state. Looks like you have 4.266 million people, 11th fastest growing state in the nation, 10th largest state in geographic area. #1 for driving. So whatever you're doing at ITE Oregon, keep up the great work, because the public opinion poll ranked Oregon #1 among the 50 states for driving. And that really meant a lot to me when I was making the drive from Clovis, California, clear up to Redmond, Washington for the Cascadia Rail Summit. It was like by the time I crossed from California into Oregon, it was God's gift for making it this far. And the last time I was in Oregon was back in November. I drove from Clovis all the way up to Medford, Clovis being right next to Fresno, to buy an iMac, because when you take into account that Oregon has no sales tax, it really saves you a lot of money when you're purchasing like a major computer system. And so certainly, hopefully, Oregon will be open to having some meetings with Nevada. on how to make the housing picture work, because there are certain parts of Nevada that have the housing picture down better than others. You have the Economic Development Association of Western Nevada, whose influence is primarily in the Reno-Sparks area, but they haven't had a chance to advance their advocacy into areas like Fallon. So Fallon, great place to live. The challenge is that the housing hasn't necessarily kept up. We have a lot of great community amenities, but as far as housing is concerned, a 1950s farmhouse with an upgraded kitchen is still a 1950s farmhouse. And you have a lot of folks that come to Fallon from places like San Diego, where the housing opportunities are amazing. So that's the flyer on traffic for housing. Now, I had a chance to take a look at some hot topics when it came to housing in Fallon relative to other places in the nation. And the big call to action for us as traffic engineers is to try to reinvent the traffic engineering profession so that it is much more friendly toward housing development, namely creative transportation infrastructure funding mechanisms. So a lot of the folks who work at the Fallon Naval Air Station, they come up from San Diego. And this is the type of housing that they are expecting. They are used to the pools and the waiting pools, the multifamily residential, the views of the ocean, and of course, numerous amenities within the community center. So typical housing in the San Diego vicinity, which is a source of a lot of the folks who are working at the Fallon Naval Air Station, they have their high expectations when it comes to housing. Here's the flip side. You have a jobs to housing mismatch in Fallon. You have the Fallon Naval Air Station, which has a very innovative campus layout, and it is a major technology employer in Churchill County. However, this is the typical housing that you'll see in places like Fallon, Nevada, mobile home parks, and then your high-end housing, single family detached, built in the 50s. Now, there are a number of development projects that are in the works in Fallon, namely the Coleman Road multifamily residential development project that is posing 425 multifamily housing units to significantly transform the housing situation in Fallon, where we've seen almost no new multifamily residential construction in the past 30 years. When you bring multifamily residential developments to a community, you also bring a number of other amenities. This is Madera County, just north of Fresno County in California, that had the Riverstone residential development that came online and was voted the nation's #1 master plan community in 2018. And associated with that is the Valley Children's Hospital that also came online around the same time and was voted among the best children's hospitals in the nation. So the whole idea, when you bring housing, you bring a whole lot more than just housing. You bring high-tech employers, you bring lots of valuable amenities to serve the community. And then within the Riverstone development itself, you have a huge community center with spacious living, dining, kitchen area, a pool complex, and of course, there are additional outdoor amenities, outdoor kitchen, barbecue grills, sinks, menu board, overhead fans, community fountains surrounded by lounge chairs. And of course, you have your chalkboard there where you can even teach courses in cooking. That's what Phelps is hoping to bring to Fallon, but they have to make the case to investors first as to why invest in places like Fallon. What we start with is asking the question, why invest in the silver state of Nevada? Now, Nevada, unfortunately, is not #1 for driving. Oregon took that position. Nevada has around 3.2 million people, 7th largest state in geographic area, significant diversity in density, and less rain falls in Nevada than any other state. So you'd think places like Churchill County and specifically Fallon being branded as the oasis of Nevada would attract lots of investment and lots of housing to the silver state. But in reality, Fallon is beyond the Northern California mega region. It is beyond the Economic Development Authority of Western Nevada's influence area and consequently has not had the advocacy in housing the way Reno and Sparks has. So why invest in the silver state of Nevada? Like Oregon, Nevada has significantly fewer barriers to prosperity. Oregon, I understand, is one of the least expensive places in the nation to do business, which would explain why you've been so successful in places like Medford at attracting a number of high-tech employers. Nevada, like Washington, does not have a state income tax, and it also does not have anywhere near the barriers to prosperity that a regulation on steroids environment like the Golden State to the west has. And so people are actually finding a lot of value in going back to the state that they skipped over during the gold rush era. So Nevada is known for having a rich history and a booming housing market, except that it has taken off in certain places better than others. And I'm wishing that we'd had a whole lot more Nevada ITE folks at the ITE meeting in Oregon back in 2004, when the streetcar made its debut and we had all that brand new housing in construction in downtown. So we have a rich railroading history with expedited access to the ports of Oakland, Stockton, and West Sacramento, as well as Los Angeles, Long Beach, and even the Port of Portland helps make the case in Nevada for investing in industry. You have a rich railroading history, but the railroading history in Nevada has been more for the movement of goods rather than the movement of people. And then housing is catching on in Reno. In fact, Reno is by far the hottest housing market in all of Nevada. 21% home value increase in Reno just in the past year. The biggest little city in the world with a booming housing market in certain parts where you're able to actually get the EDONs in the world to make the case for housing. Reno has had to rebrand itself from a gambling town to a technology hub. And it is very quickly rebranding itself as being Silicon Valley East, in that we've seen a number of casinos close down, such as the Virginian and Harrah's, but on the other hand, we're still seeing a bit of an influx now in population after Reno has recovered from the COVID, as well as the crash in the gambling market. What Reno has done is it's redeveloped its waterfront, and it's rebranding itself as a gateway to the Tahoe Sierras. And of course, you have a number of great restaurants along the Truckee River, and Smee's actually had one item on the menu that wasn't seafood. They had hamburgers, so that I was able to actually eat there. So I'm not quite as much of a fan of seafood as perhaps others, but it is a growing picturesque technology hub with a 21% increase in home values just in the past year, as the gateway to Lake Tahoe Basin with destination villages and world-renowned ski resorts. And of course, you have quality housing, sports entertainment, and even a dog park in Reno, but the housing element is notably absent in places like Fallon. So you have a bunch of these high-rise housings that's under construction. You have the Greater Nevada Field, as well as the biggest little dog park for dog lovers. But what about transportation in the silver state of Nevada? Well, it's very helpful if the current director of NDOT, Christina Swallow, was the former ASCE president. And so she's been able to bring a lot of advocacy to the silver state. And even though the silver state and its Golden State neighbor to the west, in a lot of respects, are polar opposite, they do agree that they need to work together to make extraordinary transportation funding ideas happen. One of the potentials for Reno is to become a hub for high-speed rail, if we're able to actually get high-speed rail into Sacramento, because it's quite a treacherous journey going from Sacramento to Reno. And then innovations in transit and active transportation are continuing to make their way in places like Reno and Sparks. This is the Sparks Transit Hub. This is Skybridge and Sparks. And then, of course, you have the Tahoe Pyramid Trail. And Sparks is the Victorian village of the Silver State. For those of you who are familiar with I-80, that's where John Osquaga's Nugget is located. And additionally, you have a number of transit-oriented development amenities right around the corner from that housing, which really makes for an interesting quality of life in Sparks. And of course, rivaling Silicon Valley, you actually have places where it keeps track of the number of available parking spaces. And then you have the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, which is midway between Sparks and Fernley, yet there's no residential. So that poses significant VMTs, vehicle miles traveled. But certainly if you have a chance to travel between Sparks and Fernley on I-80 heading east, be sure to stop midway through and check out the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center. And then of course you have the city of Fallon, which is struggling with the provision of housing because they're part of it, they're concerned about not wanting a whole bunch of Californians to move in. But it's got a lot of great amenities. It has the water wheel, it has the Churchill County Courthouse, it has its volunteer fire department, educational opportunities, convention opportunities, and they're even constructing a civic center. And then of course, Carson City. Carson City is an independent city, the only city in Nevada that is not a part of a county. A major event is the Hot Dogs Nights. And so the Batmobile tends to be quite popular. Carson City, of course, being named after Kit Carson. And then, of course, within the Nugget, you have a lot of like historical imagery. And of course, Nevada is well known for entertainment. But let's take a quick dive into the PowerPoint and see what it is about the Silver State that's attracting a lot of attention. So specifically, 10 successes among the nation's 10 most business-friendly states, no corporate or personal income taxes, low-cost startup regulatory license, annual fees, high-tech workforce, port accessibility, aviation, although I should mention that LAS, Las Vegas, would definitely benefit by having an automated people mover between the airport terminal and the remote car rental facility. It took me a good hour to get from the airport terminal to the rental car facility to rent a car to drive from Las Vegas to Reno, which is a close to a 460-mile drive. Nevada, interestingly enough, does not have an interstate freeway system that connects the two major population centers. And of course, low utility rates, abundant commercial real estate, abundance of visitors, and of course, scenery. And NDOT has had a number of successes, including the Connect Rail Plan, the infra grant for the I-15 Tropicana, Information Superhighway and Innovations in Broadband, ENR Owner of the Year for Project Neon and Interstate 11, which they're going to start building it south to Phoenix, and then eventually it's going to go north, and the route through Fallon is the preferred route. And then prepare to stop when amber flashing signals on the high-speed approaches are becoming more and more commonplace. So Northwest Nevada is an extension of the Northern California mega region. Oregon is located, much of Oregon from Eugene to the north is within the Cascadia mega region. If you want a sales pitch, check out what Christine Gregoire, former Washington State governor, has to say about all the innovation coming out of the Cascadia mega region. You can go to www.ushsr.com, click on events and Seattle 2019, and that will bring you to Christine Gregoire's sales pitch on the Cascadia mega region. So all the innovations going on in Portland, keep up the great work. Let's see how Nevada fits into the NorCal mega region. The NorCal mega region extends north into Reno, and then the SoCal mega region extends into Las Vegas. You'll notice that Las Vegas is comparable in population to Portland, but they have quite a bit more freeway capacity, but quite a bit less innovation when it comes to reducing the VMTs, so to speak. And then median home listing price by city, Reno is by far the hottest housing market in the state of Nevada right now, quite a ways ahead of places like Las Vegas and North Las Vegas. Fallon is surprisingly affordable, yet the housing advocates just haven't had a chance to make their way out to Fallon because they've found all kinds of greener pastures in the Reno and Sparks area. Nevada median household income, Henderson being by far the wealthiest part of Nevada, but with places like Reno being the such rapidly increasing housing prices, Reno is definitely a better bet than the stock market for that matter. But you'll notice that with the income to housing ratio, and when we take a look at the demographics from the San Jose and San Francisco, you notice that Fallon and Fernley actually have some benefit in terms of the money going quite a bit further than in places like San Jose and San Francisco, which would explain why there's quite the exodus out of Northern California and over to places like Nevada and Oregon, where the barriers to prosperity are not nearly as great. So you notice that San Jose and San Francisco have quite the population and quite the income. The challenge is that the money does not go particularly far in San Francisco and San Jose, even though the salaries are up there. You notice that your money actually goes barely moves in places like San Jose. It moves a little bit further in places like San Francisco. Clovis is attracting a lot of engineers. That's where I'm broadcasting from right now. It's one of the best kept lifestyle affordability secrets throughout the Northern California mega region, which extends as far south as Fresno and Clovis. And then, of course, one of the areas that Nevada has done extremely well that makes Sacramento very jealous is it has been able to bring all kinds of high-tech employers to the area, particularly within the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, yet it lacks the housing. So Nevada definitely has this act together when it comes to attracting the tech employers, yet the struggle happens to be with the housing in that Trick has no housing whatsoever, and a lot of it was due to the politicians that were more concerned about re-election than investing in what was most important to the people. But we are seeing a lot of high-rise residential development in Reno. I'm sure that some of those who made the decisions were inspired by the ITE meeting in Portland back in 2004. And as we mentioned before, Reno is rebranding itself from a gambling town to a picturesque technology hub. It was looking like North Las Vegas was going to be taking over the third place position, but Reno was able to do some very rapid rebranding. And now they are actually attracting a lot of high-tech professionals, primarily working at the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, among other places. Sparks, of course, being the Victorian village of the Silver State. Yet Fallon is where we see the huge disconnect between technology jobs and housing. In fact, over a quarter of the Naval Air Station employees commute from another county, and Nevada only has 16 counties, so you're talking very lengthy commutes just because of the lack of housing in Fallon. But you do have the amenities such as the Civic Center and the educational opportunities. And Phelps has definitely been able to make the case for investors investing in housing in Fallon based on the fact that Fallon has had very little new residential construction within the past 20 to 30 years. They're only building like 1/10 of the housing that is needed. And that's not even taking into account for the new fighter pilot that's going to be start getting deployed out of the Fallon Naval Air Station. So here's the disconnect. 32 housing units added per year versus 500 housing units per year that are needed. And a lot of those folks working at the Fallon Naval Air Station are coming from San Diego, and we're seeing the big disconnect, but we're also seeing what the possibilities are if we bring a bunch of multifamily residential into the communities like Fallon. Fernley is catching on quite a bit more, Fernley being quite a bit closer to the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center. You'll notice that the VMT metric took effect in California in July 1st, 2020. And these were a number of the areas that they were addressing with regard to challenges. They wanted to make it easier to build housing in California because the traffic impact mitigation fees were getting so high that the developers simply didn't have any incentive to build anything other than high-end residential, whereas the huge need was middle to low-end residential. So you'll notice that there's the early adoption of new innovations in places like Fernley. The roundabout in Fernley was actually built before the national roundabout standards were well established. And then as different parts of Nevada grew, we were able to see quite a bit more innovations in areas like Reno and Incline Village when it came to roundabouts. And this is the final slide, but here are some 10 traits of success that Nevada is encouraged to look at as it rebrands traffic engineering to bring housing to places that are so desperately needed, particularly places like Fallon. We want to make sure that the I-11 alignment actually goes through Fallon. The I-11 is definitely needed because I've actually made the drive from Las Vegas to Reno. There is an Area 51. There is an Alien Cafe as you enter the gateways to Area 51. It's primarily a lot of two-lane roads. And we want to make sure as well that we're able to find creative funding mechanisms for transportation, primarily heavy investment in grant funding, high capacity intersections. And we want to make sure that we are able to put the multifamily close to retail and employment, because unfortunately the mark was missed with the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, and the complete streets placemaking, multimodal connectivity. The 15-minute community concept I see is a very major innovation that started in Portland and has caught on in much of the rest of the nation. And then, of course, being willing to evaluate transportation through the lens of the vehicle miles traveled metric. If you want more information on the VMT metric, go to the Northern California section of ITE, and that's been the major resource center. With that, I'm open to any questions.
Well, thank you, David. I think I'm convinced. I'm packing up my things and moving to Nevada first thing tomorrow. We do have a question in the chat for you from Matt. Matt asks, how much of the Fallon new housing and investments have been targeted towards the Paiute Shoshone people? And apologies for mispronouncing that if I did.
So there hasn't been too much specific targeting. And this was one of the questions that actually came up when this was being presented to Nevada ITE. How do you make sure that the type of housing that is being invested in meets the needs of the community? What they did with the Sacramento Rail Yards project, which is finally coming to fruition after 13 years of hype of being hyped up as the nation's largest urban infill project, is the city of Sacramento is specifying that a certain number of the units need to be affordable. So we're seeing cities like San Jose, Sacramento, San Francisco that have set-asides that a certain number of housing units need to be affordable, and the cities are actually kicking in some of the funds to make that a reality.
All right. Well, we are at time, so I just want to thank David, Sean, and Matt for the wonderful presentation. Let me just share my screen here. So we will move into our second break. Which will be 10 minutes. So I hope to see everyone back here at 3:20 p.m. and we'll have our third and final set of speakers. Perfect. I see your slides, Anthony.
Perfect. And see me and hear me all right?
Yep.
That reminds me, I'm gonna join from my computer now too. Give me a moment on that.
You want to test it out too, Smith?
Yes, I do. Or yes, I should.
All right, I'll stop sharing.
I'm not there yet. I still gotta log in. All right, should be coming in right now. All right, I'm in, but I don't, oh, there we go.
Which one's the real Smith? We'll never know.
My voice is coming from one place. Everything else is coming from another. It's tricky like that. Give me a second. All right, this should be sharing just my presentation screen.
Yep. We see
Okay,
that.
gonna highlight two. They're gonna try to do two different things to make sure it works. Did that come through on the right screen?
Mhm. I see a red squiggly.
And
Yep. And I
dots.
see a laser pointer. Yep.
Excellent. All right, I'm good to go.
Perfect. So welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had another good break. I see the chat's been a little more active. So how about everyone throw in an emoji of how you're feeling right now in the chat. I'll find one really quick. I might be the only emoji then. There we go. My mind has been blown by some of these presentations. It's been great so far. So let's go ahead and get started. Our next speaker is Anthony Davies. Anthony is a 2010 graduate from Oregon State University with a master's in engineering and is a registered professional engineer in Oregon. Anthony's current position is a senior engineer at Washington County's Department of Land Use and Transportation, where he's worked for the past 10 years. Anthony's senior engineer role involves managing the county's road design and construction standards, as well as supervising a team of county engineering staff who design many transportation-related projects for the county. Anthony's primary focus at the county is bridge engineering, but he has served as design lead on a wide variety of projects, including pedestrian bicycle infill projects, ADA ramp retrofit projects, and intersection improvement projects. Prior to working at Washington County, Anthony worked at the Oregon Department of Transportation construction offices in both Regions 2 and 4, where he worked on many different construction projects, including the Highway 20 Pioneer Mountain to Eddyville project. Anthony is passionate about addressing our nation's aging bridge infrastructure, as well as improving bicycle and pedestrian accessibility across the county. So with that, Anthony, we're excited to have you. I'll give the floor to you.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you for having me here today to talk about a project that I'm very passionate about. This is my first time attending an ITE event, so maybe a new name and face to many of you. As mentioned, my focus is in bridge engineering, but hopefully there will be parts of this presentation interesting for everyone here today. So in the summer of 2021, Washington County designed and built a pedestrian and bike bridge in unincorporated Aloha, Oregon. This bridge serves as a vital network connection to the neighboring community. For the first time ever, elementary school children have a safe way to bike or walk to their school. Here's a brief overview of the topics that I will be talking about today. The first topic is the project background, where I'll speak about how the project was developed. Next, to talk about some of the unique project design elements. And then I'll do a dive into the construction phase of the project, where we will take a closer look at some of the issues that came up during construction. Afterwards, I'll go over some of the post-construction results, which looks at community feedback and usage of the new facility. Finally, I'll wrap up the presentation with the conclusion, where I'll talk about some of the lessons learned on this project, as well as some of the next steps for the neighborhood. So without further ado, let's get started. So this project is located in an urban, unincorporated area of Washington County known as Aloha. The area is bordered by Hillsborough to the west and Beaverton to the east. There are many nearby attractions to the project location, including the Beaver Acres Elementary School, TriMet Max and bus service, as well as a 222-acre Walton Hills Nature Park, which has more than 5 miles of trails for recreation. So in the mid-2010s, there were many studies developed with a common goal of improving livability in the greater Washington County area. The first study that really identified this bridge project was the Aloha Reedville study, which was first published in 2014. This was a culmination of a years-long collaborative effort to come up with a plan to improve the livability of the two largest unincorporated areas of Washington County. Historically, these two areas have not seen the same level of investment as other areas of the county and are therefore lacking in basic infrastructure. One goal of the study was looking at opportunities to infill existing sidewalk gaps and building out the regional trail system. From the study, the Augusta Lane Bridge project met both of these objectives and was identified as a high priority improvement for the area. The bridge project's benefits were further analyzed with the health impact assessment. This study identified several primary and secondary benefits that would be provided by this new connection. By creating a safe, interconnected pedestrian network, people are motivated to walk and bike more, which leads to a healthier community. Likewise, the study cites research that shows students who are more physically active perform better academically. Another benefit provided is fewer gas emissions due to people choosing to walk or bike to their destination rather than driving. It is estimated that this project will reduce the total trip of a resident in this area from 2 miles down to half a mile. Similarly, the school district could eliminate 3 bus routes for the school, resulting in a savings of $45,000 per year. With evidence showing the positive benefits of this connection, the Augusta Lane Bridge was added to the county's TSP, and the Board of Commissioners formally approved the project for our main funding source, which had a funding cycle for 2018 through 2023. So let's take a step back and look at the demographics of Aloha and the community that this project would serve. Aloha covers an area of 7.4 square miles and is comprised mostly of residential single-family housing built in the 70s and 80s. Here's some interesting facts about the community, keeping in mind that these are 2019 numbers. The area has a population of 54,287 residents, which would make it the 4th largest city in Washington County if it was incorporated. It has a proportionally larger population of citizens not born in the US, as well as non-white ethnicity representation. As evidence of the community being underserved by the county, 20% of children live below the poverty line, compared to 13% countywide, as well as the median property value being significantly lower than the rest of the county. It's also important to look at the commuting breakdown for residents of the area. So obviously there would be probably a higher percentage of work from home if this survey was taken today, but this does show the large disparity in the community. Almost 3/4 of the respondents drove alone to work, while only 7% took public transit and 2% biked or walked. While some of this may be the result of our society's cultural norms, it is also important to look at the infrastructure or lack thereof in the area to provide opportunities for shifting transportation modes. These 3 images were taken from Aloha streets located less than a mile from each other. I think this paints a pretty good picture of the wide spectrum of road systems located in Aloha, spanning from narrow roads with no sidewalks on the left to busy 5-lane arterials on the right. The project is located on a stretch of undeveloped county-owned right-of-way through forest land. The county owns this right-of-way due to future plans for a roadway extension. However, since Augusta Lane is classified as a neighborhood route, this road extension is quite unlikely. This undeveloped area includes Beaverton Creek, which is approximately 50 foot wide in this location. There's also identified a 300-foot wide floodplain that extends most width of this area, as well as 2 isolated wetlands. Each end of the project only has existing sidewalk on one side of the road, the north side on the west end of the project, and the south side to the east. So the main goal of the project is to provide year-round walking and biking access to nearby amenities to make a more livable and healthy community. On the left side, you see a rough image highlighting the households who would benefit from a shorter trip to amenities to the east. Currently, Beaverton Creek acts as a natural barrier with very few local streets crossing the creek. I highlighted the term year-round since this was a point of discussion in the project planning and budgeting process. The initial plan was to have a bridge only span Beaverton Creek and be shorter in length, while the rest of the path would just follow the natural contours of the land. Since this was meant to provide a vital year-round link to the elementary school, the project team felt it was important to keep the entire trail above the floodplain to avoid winter shutdowns and minimize maintenance costs. I wanted to include this slide so you can quickly see the existing context of the overall neighborhood. The blue shows existing sidewalk, while red shows our sidewalk gaps. The new bridge is highlighted in yellow with connecting sidewalks in green. You can see quite a large disparity in existing sidewalks from the west end of the job to the east side of the job. This image really highlights that while the bridge creates a vital link between the 2 neighborhoods, there's still a lot of work that the county has to do. Next, I'll be doing a deep dive into some of the unique project design elements for this bridge. I'll be covering more of these topics in more detail, but did want to highlight that we had restrictions on grades in this project to make sure the path was ADA compliant. One unique aspect of this particular bridge is that the foundations were designed internally by the county, while the steel bridge was designed and fabricated by the contractor. Since there are many steel bridge fabricators in the US, we wanted to provide a competitive bidding process to ensure we got the most economical bridge. By designing the bridge foundations internally, it ensured that design costs were kept low and under the county's control. The design team came up with assumed load reactions to complete the foundation design. And then these values were shared with the contractor to ensure their design would not overload the piles. To simplify design even further, we used a design that used 2 identical span lengths, so the contractor could use the same design for both bridge spans. It was decided early in design that the bridge would be constructed with weathering steel. The material allows for a longer clear span compared to other materials such as aluminum, while the weathering allows it to blend in more easily with the natural environment. We also decided to specify Brazilian ITE timber decking due to its superior performance and resistance to insect damage, rot, and long-term shrinkage. On this slide, I provided the plan and profile views of the bridge as shown in our contract drawings. You'll note that the bridge does have a deflection point in the middle pier, which did add some complexities to the design and construction. While a straight bridge alignment would have been preferable, this alignment was chosen to move the bridge further away from the adjacent homes, the 2 ends, while also avoiding wetland impacts, underground utilities, and mature trees. Here's a brief look at the completed bridge. You can see the middle pier in both photos, which has a concrete cap poured over steel piles that extend above the ground. You can kind of see how both weathering steel and decking help the structure blend into the surroundings. Related to the bridge design was the complication of working around existing sanitary sewer lines. These lines were the original system built in the 60s and are reaching the end of their design life. A particular concern was the 8-inch service line that ran parallel to the bridge footprint. Despite shifting the middle pier, we could not avoid the service line at the east abutment. We adapted the foundation design to minimize impacts to the line. We increased the pile spacing to provide as much separation from the sewer line as possible, as well as requiring the contractor to provide a pre and post construction video inspection of the pipe. At both ends of the project, we installed combined bicycle access ramps and ADA accessible ramps. These ramps allow bicyclists to return to the shoulder bike facility at both ends, while also allowing wheelchair users to access neighboring streets. These ramps also served as the natural transition from our 10-foot multi-use path to the existing 5-foot sidewalk located at both ends. Another important goal of the project was to provide 24-hour safe access through the neighborhood. Since the bridge crossed undeveloped forest land, there is no ambient light sources to help illuminate the path. So as a result, the design team implemented pedestrian scale lighting at the approaches and along the bridge span. For the approaches, we opted for LED bollard lighting located outside the path footprint. And along the bridge, we selected a proprietary LED system that was embedded in the handrail tubing. Since it's best to share this photo now, here's one of my favorite images of the project. This is a nighttime shot that shows the handrail lighting in action. You can see that we staggered the lighting, which kind of provided a unique visual effect, while also providing continuous illumination across the bridge. Due to the vicinity of desirable local amenities, the project also installed wayfinding signage and striping for bicyclists and pedestrians. We added neighborhood bikeway signs to the top of existing street signs to designate the route. On the right, you can see the route through the neighborhood, which provides a connection between 185th Avenue and 170th. At all intersections, we provided wayfinding signs as well as directional bicycle sharrows in the roadway. As part of the project, we also added planting to the vegetated corridor on the site. A vegetated corridor is defined as a swath on both sides of natural resources to be protected from development to provide a natural buffer to these resources. For this project, we added plantings to all areas located within the right-of-way, whether it was existing or not. This resulted in the project enhancing 0.22 acres of existing vegetated corridor and adding 0.05 acres of new vegetated corridor. The project included 2 different plant communities within the project limits: ash forested wetland and areas that are frequently inundated with water, and upland forest communities above the floodplain. Plant species were carefully selected to match existing vegetation in the region. And in total, we planted 143 new trees and 688 new shrubs. So while we all wish that our projects would be completed without any issues or challenges, we know that is simply not feasible. Following is a highlight of the larger issues that were encountered during construction. One of the first issues that the team encountered was the constructability of the bridge. Since the project was located on undeveloped land, we needed a way to get equipment and materials to the middle of the project to construct the middle bridge pier. However, as you can see, there were a lot of natural barriers that made the alignment and selection of a access road challenging. On the west side, there is a sharp drop-off, which you can vaguely see from the LiDAR imagery at the bottom. Likewise, there's a large wetland that encompassed nearly the entire right-of-way limits. We decided to build the access road on the west side. We'd have to add fill to the wetland to create a road accessible by a crane. Constructing an access road on the east side is only marginally better. While topography is more favorable, we'd also have to contend with going over Beaverton Creek. Our design team worked closely with the ODFW to provide specifications that ensured temporary access bridge would span the entire creek channel and minimize impacts. And at that point, we made the choice to provide access from the east side. So each bridge span was going to be shipped in 3 sections, approximately 55 feet each, and would be spliced together in place at the job site. When possible, these bridge sections were supported by temporary shoring. However, there were site constraints, which meant the contractor had to use 2 cranes in certain locations to install the bridge spans. And so here you see a very rough sketch of their erection plan. The temporary gravel access road comes in from the east, crosses over the creek with a large crane pad near the middle pier so it could erect both spans. I have a few slides that kind of show this plan in action. So on the right, you can see the gravel access road that they constructed. Need to be extra wide to provide adequate maneuverability for the crane equipment. And on the left, you see the temporary steel bridge. Since this was a short duration bridge, it was installed on spread footings, and see that they accomplished in spanning the entire waterway. On the left, you can kind of make out the twin crane setup they used when they couldn't do shoring. The smaller crane on the right is sitting on a driveway and is simply there to keep the first section suspended, while the larger crane then picked up the next section and moved it into place. You can see it on the right side of the crane bringing the section into place, where they would then splice the 2 sections together. On the left, you can see the shoring system used to support the bridge sections. And on the right, you can see one of the bridge splices. And each splice section required 350 bolts to be secured. Next, we ran into a few constructability issues related to the bridge fabrication. While the project plans indicated a pinned connection at the middle pier, the steel workers erroneously installed expansion base plates at this location. And while this wasn't a catastrophic error, it did mean that the design needed to be modified to account for thermal expansion and contraction where the 2 spans met. For the handrail, we came to a solution that involved installing a smaller pipe sleeve in one span with a bend to match the angle of the other span. That way the sleeve could slide back and forth in one span and provide a continuous handrail. Similarly, the fabricator did not provide a plan for providing a continuous safety rail at the middle of the bridge. Per standards, pedestrian rail can't have any opening larger than 4 inches. With the deflection at the middle of the bridge, we had an opening between these two members that was closer to 3 feet. So the contractor came up with a small panel that was independently welded to each bridge span, while also providing a small gap between the two to allow for expansion and contraction. The last major issue that arose from this project stemmed from complaints by adjacent property owners. Since this project was literally built in their backyards, they saw firsthand many people walking on their property to gain access below the bridge. So to be good neighbors, we had the contractor install protective fencing to provide some privacy and restricting access under the bridge. So the bridge was officially opened on September 4th, just in time for the start of the new school year. While I won't read off all of these quotes, the outpouring of positive support of the project was immediate and plentiful. Early in the project, we had a lot of negative feedback from the neighbors, claiming that no one would use the bridge and it would ruin the character of their neighborhood. I'm sure many of you in the audience have similar stories. So it was great to see such a combined showing of support for the bridge. I would like to highlight the image in the middle, which shows a young girl biking to school, something that just wasn't possible before this project was finished. So small highlight that really made the project feel worth all the effort. Now that the bridge was built, of course, we were curious to see how it was performing. We had a consultant collect bike and ped counts several months after the grand opening. This data was collected just recently on February 17th, which showed that 101 pedestrians and 14 bicyclists used the bridge in a single day. It should be noted that this data was collected on a cold February day, so this data is likely skewed to the lower end of counts. So we do hope to get a second set of counts in the summer months to see if we get higher usage of the bridge. Either way, this does show that there's a positive usage of the bridge. I really wanted to qualify these counts into tangible benefits. I did make some pretty broad assumptions to simplify the math, but I think it still helps put things into perspective. I took the 115 pedestrians and bicyclists from our traffic counts and applied it to an entire year, not considering seasonal adjustments due to weather. I also assume that each pedestrian and bicyclist was equivalent to 1 trip, which is probably not completely accurate due to users traveling in groups. With those caveats aside, while 115 users each day may not seem like much, this equates to roughly 42,000 saved trips each year and approximately 63,000 vehicle miles saved each year. But there are also other secondary benefits. Like I said earlier, the school district is able to eliminate 3 bus routes, which will result in savings of tens of thousands. Likewise, hopefully this bridge will cause more folks to consider alternative transportation, such as taking public transit to work, so we can slowly reduce the number of residents who drive alone to work. The final cost of the project was $2.07 million, which was higher than the original $1.55 million. The cost difference is directly related to the scope changing to span the entire floodplain. In my opinion, the extra 500,000 investment was to ensure kids could walk to school all months of the year was worth it. Of course, with every project, there are lessons to be learned. I believe a lot of the resistance from the community in the early design phase was a direct result of inadequate public outreach. When the county held an open house, the decision was already made and people felt like their voices weren't being heard. By engaging them early and often, the design team could have helped address many of their concerns and been better equipped to incorporate the community's feedback. The project was also on an aggressive schedule, being completed in less than 15 months once funding was allocated. There are many discussions of adding extra features such as art pieces, interpretive information plaques, benches. However, due to the tight schedule, there just wasn't enough time to coordinate this work with the park district. Finally, better coordination between the bridge fabricator, bridge installer, and our inspection team could have helped avoid many of the unnecessary construction issues. However, we were fortunate to have a great contractor who was creative in coming up with practical solutions. I will quickly gloss over it because I think we're getting short on time, but as addressed earlier, you know, there's a lot of sidewalk gaps to the west of the project and lacking infrastructure in the area. So there is future investments in this neighborhood, including providing continuous sidewalk to 185th. So this is where the sidewalk ends on the image to the left beyond our bridge. So plans to extend sidewalk. Plan to put in a enhanced crossing at the image to the right to provide access to the bus stop, as well as adding bike facilities and sidewalk to the road to the south. I'd like to briefly acknowledge the great partners we've had on this project. I won't individually name them all, but we'll say that each played a vital role in ensuring this project's success from inception to completion. With that, that's all the slides I had. If there's not time for questions, I will hang out in the chat. Otherwise, there's my contact information. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anthony. I appreciated that you had pictures of the placement of the stands. I always think that's really interesting to see. Always requires a bit of creativity. We do have time for maybe one or two questions if there are any in the chat. While we're waiting, I will ask, you had a picture of the bike ramp in there, and I thought that was interesting. So maybe could you talk a little bit more about some of the standards or guidance you followed? And I'm specifically interested in the decision to include the detectable warning, the truncated dome there.
Yeah, so as I said, it's a little bit tricky in this context because this spot does meet the definition of an intersection, because we do have two roadways at this location. So there was a lot of discussion, yes, of a dedicated bike ramp with no adjusting the geometry based on best practices to make it function as a bike ramp. But we also wanted to make this ADA accessible to account for both users to use that ramp.
Got it. Thank you. And we do have a question in the chat from Molly. Molly asks, with the lessons learned around community engagement, has there been any changes in approach for similar projects in the county?
Yeah, so, if there's always room for improvement, right? But I think if there's one good thing that came out of the pandemic is that we've moved a lot of our open house engagement to online open houses. So pre-COVID, the county stance was pretty much exclusively in-person open houses. And, these were always, at 6 p.m. on a weeknight at the local library. And, that ended up being quite a big barrier to, working class families or, whatever that have children that make it challenging to attend in-person open houses. So, and as well as I think with pandemic, with these open houses, it's allowed people to become much more engaged and a lot more informed about the projects. So yeah, like I said, if one good thing came out of the pandemic has been the change to virtual open houses to improve engagement.
All right. Well, thanks, Anthony. A great presentation. We definitely appreciate it. And I think we'll move along to our next presentation.
We have one question in chat. came up.
Did I miss it?
Yeah. Yeah, Molly had a question saying, with lessons learned around community engagement, has there
Oh.
been any changes in approach for similar projects? And they,
Yeah. We just covered that.
oh, sorry.
No worries.
There was another one. I thought there was another one too. Man.
The chat's buzzing though. There's a lot of activity.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. All right, Smith, if you'd like to share your screen. And
All right, that should do it.
Yep, we see it. So Smith Siromaskal, did I pronounce your last name right?
Hey, first time, awesome.
All right. Smith runs the Oregon Traffic Group for HDR from the local Portland office. His group has cross-trained staff in complex traffic simulation and roadway design, and is involved in interchange design work across the globe. He is a graduate of the University of Illinois, and over 23 years has developed a background in roadway design and traffic analysis. His diverging diamond interchange experience began over a dozen years ago on I-5 exit 14 in Southern Oregon. Since then, he has been involved in approximately 100 different project sites, with over 40 projects carried into the design process, half of which are open to traffic, including the smallest diverging diamond interchange in the world in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the largest diverging diamond interchange in the world in Sarasota, Florida. These diverging diamond interchanges also include the first interchange in 13 different states or provinces. He was on the panel that wrote the Utah Department of Transportation Diverging Diamond Interchange Design Guidelines, wrote the post-evaluation study of the first diverging diamond interchange in the US, and recently finished a best practice on diverging diamond interchange analysis in BISM for the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. So I take it you know a thing or two about diverging diamond interchanges. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Smith.
Thank you very much. So basically, as you might have heard or noticed, we were talking about the fact that exit 14 right there was the very first one that I was involved in. And you'll know that right now, that's not a DDI. In fact, the one that is a DDI is this one just up the road, exit 24. So one of the things that I want to be clear about during the course of this presentation, all these project sites are ones that I've worked on. So all the mistakes that have been made that I'm going to point out, they are mine, or I was involved in them one way or another. So I'm not throwing anybody else under the bus but myself. And these are lessons that we've learned over the course of the last last 12 years, and I have 20 minutes to do a brain dump and give it to you. So what I'm going to cover from a big picture perspective is everything from the planning section through into design and through to implementation. That, by the way, is a picture of the Sarasota DDI. It has 12 lanes in the core of the interchange, and we will get to that one as a case study of a myriad of different things in a little bit. So right off the top, please choose the right software. You can fake a DDI analysis in Synchro, but there are a whole host of shortcomings that come along with it, and it will overestimate how things progress through the DDI and as well as through the adjacent intersections. And if you're really careful about how sim traffic works, you'll also notice that with the higher speed DDIs, it cannot push the crossover traffic through the crossroad at a reasonable speed. Now, I do apologize for the fact that I'm going to go ahead and assume that everybody has at least a broad idea of what a DDI is, because I do have 20 minutes to tell you how to screw one up or how not to screw one up. So anyway, microsimulation is definitely preferred, and that's because it gives you a more granular level of detail and control over how a vehicle traverses through a DDI, because there are a myriad of different design speeds as they navigate the reverse curvature and things like that. And above all, you need to factor in lane utilization in between the terminals and the adjacent intersections. And we found in a lot of cases that the adjacent intersections, how they're designed, how they're laid out, what the traffic patterns look like at those adjacent intersections, they can drive how your project works. Even if it's outside of your limits of construction, it can make a difference in what your final design looks like at the interchange terminals themselves. Towards the tail end, I will cover a little bit about pavement slope and drainage, as well as signals and signage. But let's look first at adjacent intersections. This is an example of one of the first DDIs I worked on. And we're going to revisit this a couple of times for different lessons learned. But this is a DDI in Cabarrus County, North Carolina. This is just north of Charlotte. And what you'll see here, this is a DDI in its core, but over here to the side, there used to be a high volume T intersection with full access right there. And we realized really quickly that there was no way you could have a 3-phase signal sitting next to 2 2-phase signals, because both of these here at the ramp terminals are 2-phase signals. We didn't know it at the time, but we didn't know that it had this acronym and whatnot, but we ended up building a partial R-cut here. So you see a dual signalized median U-turn off to the west, and that is designed to accommodate a full-blown truck, WB67 in the outer lane, while a single unit truck is running on the interior lane at the same time. And we turn this into an R-cut, or a restricted crossing U-turn intersection. So you'll notice that there is no left turn coming out. What this means is this signal is either green for the main road, or it's green for the turns coming to and from that crossroad. It also means that it's a 2-phase signal, which makes it much easier to progress with the adjacent 2-phase signals. You'll also notice that there is no signalization whatsoever for the eastbound traffic. So this allowed us to make the interchange work without complicating what was immediately adjacent. And this is one of those cases where we could not have left the T intersection by itself. No matter how we worked it, even though it was a minor street, the ramp terminal was going to have impacts from the westbound queue coming off of that signal, just because of its proximity. So let's go to a different DDI. This one is outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. And this is also a very unique situation where when this originally opened to traffic, this used to be a free flow right turn going into an ad lane type situation. And these 2 lanes coming out of the core of the interchange, they were going to be basically free. So here the right turn could come together and boom, you're done. Now the problem is, if you look at the way the ramp terminal is designed, for starters, even without the geometry, the main issue was this turn over here services a couple of fast food restaurants, a couple of gas stations, and a convenience store. So there is very little different distance in between this merge point right here and that particular access. That's a weaving situation that we simply didn't notice or didn't take into account because it was outside of the limits of construction. From a capacity standpoint, this is a 3-lane section as you go further down. So we saw, hey, chance to do an ad lane, 2 + 1, 3 is a straight shot and you're done. However, this did create a weaving issue right in here. And that weaving issue is complicated by the fact that if you think about the geometry, this particular movement coming out of the core, the point, this is still turning to the left. This pavement on the ramp, this is still turning to the right. So the point of tangency of both of those alignments is somewhere out here. So what was happening was we were noticing the vehicles would come out of the right lane, out of the core of the interchange, and simply not finish the turn. That they would basically just go tangent prior to hitting the PT, and they would cut across in order to access that driveway. Even though we didn't have any accidents in the first couple of months this was open to traffic and allowed to function like this, we noticed a lot of near misses, and almost all of them were going to be that angle type side swipe type accident. So in the meantime, since this picture was taken back in, I think, 2014, this has been changed to a yield control. So those 2 lanes that come out of the core don't create a free flow weaving type scenario going into that driveway. And this driveway has since been modified to open up as a turn pocket to minimize that opportunity for that merging and weaving to take place in such a confined location. So earlier on, I talked about the fact that adjacent access, stuff that's going on outside of your limits of construction, can impact your design. What you see on the screen here is one of the most complicated DDIs we've ever worked on. And the reason it was so complicated was we couldn't touch the ramps past this point, past these points down here. This is I-25, just south of Cheyenne, Wyoming. We couldn't touch the bridge, and you can see the approach spans end right there. That's the abutment. And we also couldn't touch the radius returns going into the driveways on all 4 quadrants. And these 4 quadrants, you have a gas station, I should say truck stop rather, and a McDonald's. So all of this obviously has a lot of traffic coming to and from. What I'll also point out is once you get away from the interchange, you have 2 lanes in each direction. Although this was only recently wide, but you have 2 lanes in each direction. The old bridge right here, it used to be a 5-lane diamond, 2 through lanes in each direction and overlapping left turn lanes. And it was unsignalized. There's a massive amount of development that was forecast to the west of this location. We were told right off the bat, you can't touch the driveways, you can't touch the truck stops, you can't touch the McDonald's, you can't touch the bridge. So can you find a way to convert this into a DDI? One of the things that I'll point out, and I'll get to this later on in the presentation, is the pork chop intersections, or the pork chop islands that you see here, are very, very, very oddly shaped. And if you look closely, what we did was we reduced the cross-section of the roadway to a single lane in each direction as it goes over the top of the freeway itself. This configuration, just a 2-lane DDI, replacing even the 5-lane standard diamond, even if we were to signalize the 5-lane standard diamond, this operates far, far better than that does. And this configuration was actually able to carry you all the way out to 2050 traffic. Now, one of the unique aspects of this project, and this is something I haven't seen before or since, is the peak period truck percentage here was over 55%. This is just south of I-80. So the system interchange of 25 and 80 is just to the north of here. And these truck stops basically regularly compete for the cheapest gas in the entire state. And if you're traveling across the core of I-80 running across the southern end of the state of Wyoming, Cheyenne's really it. I mean, there's really not that much as you go to the west. You can get into Laramie, you can get into Rock Springs, but this is the big hub for traffic. From this point to the south, you're heading towards Denver, but this is the location where 25 will close to traffic should winter or blizzard conditions take place to the south of here. So a lot of traffic also needs to turn around at this location. So that's the reason for that extraordinary truck percentage. Now, what I want to point out is, even though we have 2 lanes, we had the ability to tie into a 2-lane section on either side of this. We intentionally pinched it down so that as you're leaving the DDI in each direction, you're down to 1 lane. And the reason for that was because we didn't want there to be merging and weaving taking place on the departure side of these terminals, because people were going to come off the ramp, turn right, and then try to turn left, or come through from the north and try to turn and go into this truck stop. We didn't want to create that interaction. So we intentionally pinched it down so it was not an ad lane situation on the outside. Working with closely spaced intersections, you'll notice that off to the west here is a very, very low speed frontage road. That low speed frontage road has next to no traffic going up and down it. Most of the traffic comes to and from the south and to and from the east. Massive amount of traffic, to the point where even though this is a low volume intersection, and this is a low volume intersection, you can see here that this has a dual left turn going in this direction. So what we did here, we were asked, can you make a DDI work here? Well, if you were looking at a standard type DDI, there's no way you can make it work, because you can't bring the roads back together in time to go into a T intersection at that existing frontage road. West of the frontage road is a big barren lake that cannot ever be developed. So that frontage road is never going to carry a lot of traffic. So what we developed was kind of a hybrid of a DDI for this location. This did not go into construction, but what you do see here is 2 unsignalized T intersections off to the west on a frontage road, and basically a more quote unquote normal DDI off to the right-hand side. So this is, again, one of those issues, one of those locations where what's adjacent to us drove how the interchange was designed, drove how the project was designed. Now, from a plan view, one of the things that we've noticed right off the bat as we were working with diverging diamond interchanges is they tend to freak people out in terms of looking at the plan view and going, oh my God, what is that? And one of the things we heard a lot about was this idea that you're going to make me drive on the wrong side of the road. All of that boils down to public involvement. And with DDIs, especially if you're the first one on the gate, it's more an element of public education. One of the things that we found that was very, very true in terms of the outreach was with elected officials, with stakeholders, with agency officials, was the fear of how the public was going to react was actually worse than how the public reacted. Although, to be fair, when we went to the public meetings, more often than not, what you saw was the driver's perspective or the ground view perspective. We showed people what it would look like to drive through this interchange. And we made them really well aware of the fact that basically from a driver's perspective, when you're behind the seat of the car, it looks like it's a one-way road that intersects other one-way roadways. That driver's eye perspective is a lot easier for people to digest. Just realize that when you're going to do a DDI, a lot of this becomes an element of public education. Now, for this DDI, what you're seeing on the screen right here was one of Florida's first ever YouTube videos that actually got over the 1 million view threshold. You'll see down there, this is actually taken about a year ago. I think they're around 1.5 million at this point. But we went way out of our way to basically enhance our social media presence with this particular interchange. We went so far as to have quarterly update meetings with the local college, because this was on University Parkway. I forget the name of the college, oddly enough, and local high school students. We also made sure to have a hands-on exhibit at the public meeting where people could drive little Hot Wheels cars through the plan view that was laid out on this giant table. In subsequent public involvement meetings, we've actually been able to put people behind the wheel of a simulator. So they had a steering wheel and pedals, and they could drive through the interchange with all the signing and striping in place. So they had an idea of what it would feel like to do this for real. Now, the catch to this is whoever you put out there that's public facing, they have to know their stuff. And you have to lay out a set of talking points so you're talking consistently. We went so far in this interchange to actually have a designated area in the field during construction and after it opened to traffic, where it was set aside specifically for media interviews. That's how popular this particular location was. So let's jump from public involvement to something that we really don't need to deal with in most of the state of Oregon anyway. But what I'm going to show you is an interchange in Minneapolis where this was very much a thing. The crossroad that you see on the screen here belongs to the city of St. Paul. The interstate itself, I-35E, that belonged to the state. So one of the issues was how do snowplows manage to actually plow this? Because the city would plow east-west, the state would plow north-south, which meant the state was responsible for the ramps. But given that this was in the urban core of the city, if we were to get a snowplow out here, basically they could do this. The left turns, not a problem. The right turns coming off the ramp and going to the west, not a problem, because there was a MnDOT maintenance yard just to the west of this interchange. But over here to the east, the northbound right turn, once you got past this point, all the lanes were 10 feet. And there was no place for a snowplow to be actually be able to make that U-turn. So what we did was we bowed out this particular shoulder and overbuilt a little bit of a pocket. And then we made a mountable curb right here in the median. And we made sure that that median mountable curb was facing the wrong way, so that nobody coming out of the core would see it or see a use to do something like that and make that odd U-turn movement. But that movement, if you look real closely, it has the auto turn template for a snow maintenance truck. So a snow maintenance truck can make this hook turn and then sit here, not protrude into the westbound traffic, and at the same time, the back end doesn't extend into the eastbound traffic. So realize that if for whatever reason you're designing a DDI that requires an up and over movement, either due to overheight loads or due to snow maintenance like you have here in Minnesota, that there are some extra complications that go into the design, but they're things that can be overcome. So let's go to the next spot. Pedestrians, don't stick them on the outside. We made that mistake of putting them on the outside of the core of the structure. You can see over right here and right here. We put them on the outside for the first DDI we opened traffic in Pioneer Crossing. This is part of the I-15 core design build project just south of Salt Lake City. And the reason that I say that is because if you were a pedestrian and you were walking from here and you were trying to cross and go that way, at some point you have to cross the left turning traffic. You have to cross free flow traffic. And at that location right there, that free flow location is in a very, very odd place. And the reason it's in an odd place, or that I say it's in an odd place, is because it looks like this. If you were to stand there on this crossing and you were to look back, that's what you see. The abutment wall prevents you from seeing oncoming traffic. And at the same time, if you're a car here and you're moving in the westbound direction, you have no hope of seeing a pedestrian that's on the inside of that turn. So that was a big, big lesson learned that we didn't really account for at that point in time. Now, here's the thing. If you're looking at a DEI, The main reason you're looking at it is because you have an exorbitant number of left turns in all likelihood. If you keep the pedestrians to the outside, they're going to conflict with those very turns that you're trying to build the DDI to accommodate. So whether or not you're going with the interchanges over or under the freeway, you're either going to be dealing with a bridge rail or you're going to be dealing with an abutment wall. In either case, there's going to be some sight distance issues. And the further away you pull that crosswalk, the further back the pedestrian crossing will be, and more into the point where a car is trying to accelerate. On the other hand, if you pull it back this way, that also presents some other complicating problems, and the fact that you want to probably sign that pedestrian crossing with black on yellow signs, and you're running out of room to do so if you pull that movement upstream. On the other hand, if you put the pedestrians to the inside, so here they're crossing over and they're running right in the core. 75 is a little bit weird because the median is so large. You don't need two sidewalks. Most places that have the sidewalk on the interior, it's just one single multi-use path. So ignore the fact that there are two sidewalks in the center. What you'll notice is if you put the pedestrians to the middle, they don't conflict with those high volume left turns that you were looking at earlier. And on top of that, we found, based on studies in Utah, based on studies in Florida and Missouri, that doing so, even though it's counterintuitive, that you're putting the pedestrians in the center and in between live traffic in the middle of the interchange, the public actually really, really likes it because they're barrier protected as they cross the interchange, as opposed to being just on a raised sidewalk on the outside next to a bridge rail. Now, one of the things you're going to hear a lot about when you start looking at a DDI design has to do with the angle of intersection. And the angle of intersection is a good guidance. But the angle itself is irrelevant. What you're going to find is this little piece right here is the critical element. You need to make sure that that juts out enough to prevent people from doing this. That is the single biggest safety risk. And if somebody's coming through and they're just completely unaware of what they're driving through, or they're inebriated, you don't want them to be able to go into the oncoming traffic in the core without physically hitting something. In order to develop that eyebrow, you end up with a fairly large intersection angle. You'll end up in the 30, 35, 40 degree range, but that's more of a function of creating the eyebrow as opposed to aiming for an angle and then hoping that you've created one. I mean, I can show you a couple of DDIs with 50-degree angles that don't have good eyebrows. So let's go back to College Drive. This is that tiny DDI I was talking about in Wyoming much earlier in the presentation. This was the old condition. It was basically 2 lanes in each direction, and you'll notice that there were no left turn pockets. It was fairly large. What we did with this, though, the outer pieces of the bridge here and here, they were actually full depth under the sidewalks. We milled out the sidewalks and we shoved everything to the outside, and we originally wanted to make it look like this. You'll notice that in this example, those odd pork chops that I had in the aerial photography of the finished condition, we don't have them here. This looks very normal, looks very symmetric. There aren't these little odds and ends. And one of the stipulations during the development of this project up front was, do not touch the bridge. Now, one of the things that they came out with after the fact, they said, you know what, hey, here's a design that doesn't touch the bridge. This works for everything, all the criteria that you've talked about up to this point. Then they came to us with a really strange thing because they seemed rather gleeful about it. They were like, you know, if this bridge happens to get hit, which would be cool, we could replace it. So can you also develop a 4-lane DDI that we could retrofit in when this bridge gets hit? It seemed to be an odd request, but we're like, yeah, sure, whatever. So what we did was we designed a 4-lane DDI. The 4-lane layout is what you see in blue. The original non-modified 2-lane layout is the one that's still shaped up underneath. One of the things that we wanted to do was to make it so that you would go from a 2-lane to a 4-lane with as little work as possible. So if you take a look at how these islands look, they're not in the right place at all. So they would have had to have come out here and basically ripped out all the island work and have to redo the crossovers. So what we did instead, blue is still the 4-lane, is we revised the 2-lane layout to adjust all the alignments to get the islands to better fit. So you would have to extend some, you would have to modify some, but you wouldn't have to rip the whole thing out whole hog. So long story short, these weird modifications and the fact that these islands look as strange as they do is specifically because this is designed to be retrofitted forward into a 4-lane DDI. So widening a DDI from 2 lanes to 4 lanes, it sounds intimidating because, you know, that extra lane, you can put it on the outside here, but the outside becomes the inside becomes the outside because they reverse traffic like that. So the moral of the story here out of Wyoming is, yes, you can build a DDI that can be widened, but you need to design the widened DDI first and then retrofit the design of the interim into it. So you make it so you don't have to throw a bunch of stuff away when you're done. Now, this interchange, I built this presentation a while ago, built this slide a while ago. This is the US 36 interchange in Louisville, Colorado. If you were to go out there today, this was ground zero for the wildfires that took place in December. So there isn't a single thing that's left standing at this location. That being said, one of the things that I wanted to highlight about this is the fact this interchange is unique in the fact that it has express bus service running through the core of it in both directions. It also has bus stops that are actually embedded in the core of the interchange. One of the things that made this possible was also the fact that this was only the second DDI ever to be built with the pavement slope designed the way this is. And I'm going to show you what that pavement slope design is right now. When people go and retrofit in a diamond to a DDI, they usually keep the typical section that's out there today. So the bridge, you know, centered, high crown, everything drains to the outside. But if you think about it, with a DDI in the core of the interchange, traffic is moving this way. It's not moving the way you would normally assume. So in areas, particularly in areas that have anything to do with snow and ice, snow removal equipment, the blades are always angled to the right. So if this is a diamond interchange, that's fine. The snow goes this way, no big deal. On the other hand, if this is a DDI, your wide shoulder and your pavement and your area for snow storage is on the inside. So what you don't want is for snow to get piled up in here, and then on those days when it's warm in the day and cold at night, that it planes off, it melts, planes off, and then refreezes at night. That was something that it's not an ideal situation to say the least. So this particular design was one that we developed for the first interchange that was built in the snow belt in Wisconsin. For those of you who are from the Midwest, basically lake effect snow is a real thing, and it comes down in bunches when it happens. So up here in Appleton, Wisconsin, this is an area that gets buried on a regular basis. And this was the first DDI in the country ever to be built with a low center crown. What that means is the pavement slope is always going from the driver's left to the driver's right as they navigate through the interchange. So this whole system was set up with the idea in mind to be able to store snow in the core of the interchange in the winter months. So going to construction, one of the big things that we did at university was to make sure that we plastered social media and blasted out text messages to mailing lists and things like that to help them navigate stage by stage as we went through the project process and went through the staging. One of the things that we noticed right off the bat, and this is much clearer from the drone view here, is that during construction, you need to be very cognizant of the old lane lines, because the old lane lines are the easiest lane lines to see when it gets wet. I know I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'm going to breeze through a couple of these. Now, a couple of big lessons learned on post-implementation. We're going to go over those in the next couple of slides. This one has to do with signal timing. Right now, there's a green. It's green for the eastbound direction, and it's about to go red. Once it goes red here, you'll notice that in this location, both the through movement and the turn release at the same time. That should never happen. And the reason it should never happen is this. Really, what you want to look at is you want to calculate your yellow and all red for your through movement. For these people, you want that to be based on the time it takes for those people to cross over that distance. But you don't want these people sitting here at A to wait until this additional distance has been cleared. So you want movement A to be released sooner than movement B. So when you're calculating your yellow and all red, and it's extreme in a location like this because the crossover is 5 on 5, it might not make as much of a difference when you're 2 on 2 at the crossover or 3 on 3, but at a location like this, it makes a huge, huge difference. Now going to auxiliary signals. One of the things you'll notice here is the stop bars are here and here for the ramps. which means that your signals are here and here for the ramps. Those signals are pointing this way and this way, and they offer no visibility to traffic coming down the ramp. So in a location like this, you really need to consider the line of sight for traffic to provide the proper stopping sight distance coming off of the ramp to this, particularly to the turn lanes coming off of the signals, because they'll often be well beyond the point of, well beyond the apex of the curve. And in fact, in this location, you have a line of trees as well that's blocking the inside. Going to overhead signs. Place them on the outside of the bridge. And one of the things that you'll also see is up here, when you have 3 or more lanes on the approach, make sure to put overhead truss signs up there to make sure that people are lined up in the lanes you want them to be. Once they're past this point, you do not want people changing lanes in the core of the interchange. One of the things I want to show here is we added an additional lane through the interchange. We added it here as a right lane add. That right lane really facilitates the movement coming from the ramp to do this, because we wanted to make sure, and you can see the pavement shields here on the ground that say north only for 75. We wanted to make sure that any ramp traffic that was going to the left was they were already in the lanes we wanted them to be in. We didn't want to open up a left turn bay in the core of the interchange. We wanted to make sure they were set up before they got into that core. Now, this is a mistake we've seen many, many, many times, and I made it myself here in 2012. Now, this crossing right here, go ahead, make it as short as possible, make it perpendicular, because that's going to drive your pedestrian clearance time, even though it's really not that big a deal at a two-phase signal. Do not make this crossing perpendicular. Angle this to the extent that you can. And the reason that you angle it has to do with where people are going to stop, and I'll show that on the next slide. The other issue is, and we did this without knowing because the ADA guidelines hadn't been modified yet at that point, but both the push buttons are on the same pole, and today that's a no-no. Now, the reason that I say that you don't want to put this particular stop bar perpendicular is it creates an awful lot of space between here and here. And when people cannot see where the stop bar is for rain or fog or snow or what have you, they're used to saying, okay, this is where traffic is right now. There's probably a crosswalk or something in here, so I'm going to stop a certain distance away from where that conflict is. Well, when your conflict is that far apart, notice here, by the way, that this signal is green for this movement. This guy over here, he stopped on the red, but he is nowhere near the stop bar. He's overshot the stop bar, he's overshot the crosswalk. Now, when you're working with DDIs, this is the old condition for University Parkway and I-75. This used to be a standard diamond interchange with dual turn lanes. The dual turn lane storage for this was 4,600 feet. And the reason they wanted it to be a DDI was because they overran that storage on a regular basis. Now, we told them once we did the traffic analysis, okay, you fix this, which is your obvious problem today, and you turn that into a DDI, this interchange is still going to fail. And maybe locals are like, why? And we told them it's going to fail because this intersection is going to fail. And it's going to fail because this intersection is going to fail. Well, it just so happens that the main facility, I-75, is a state route. But the crossroad here, University Parkway, is a county route. And worse yet, the county line does that. So one county has this signal, one county has this signal, and neither one of them were interested in doing anything to those adjacent intersections. So the project got built, and the project looks like this. And in the interim, to do as little as possible, on the west side here, they built a triple turn lane that's got about 3,000 feet of storage, and it overruns today. And it is starting to back up into this area. And within probably 5 to 6 years, it will likely cause the southbound exit to collapse. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of development down here in the southwest quadrant, including an international quality rowing facility. So my apologies for running a little bit long. I think I finished within a couple of minutes. My contact information is up there on the screen. So if I'm not permitted to take any questions at this point, you can just hit me up there either by phone or by email, and I'd be more than happy to answer anything you might throw my way. But thank you for coming and sticking around and putting off happy hour, even though that means a lot less when it's all virtual.
I think we can take a few questions.
Yeah, we do have a few minutes if there are any questions for Smith. I was wondering, Smith, if you could talk a little bit about you talked a little bit about the pedestrian considerations, but maybe if you could talk a little bit about the bicycle considerations in a DDI.
Sure. In fact, I had a slide that was set up just for that. I wasn't sure if I was going to have the time to do it. Let me take you to this. Okay. Bicycle considerations. One of the things is basic. It's more straightforward than the pedestrians are, for sake of argument. Basically, what you're doing with, sorry about that. With the DDI design, basically you keep them to the right. Seriously. All right, I'm going to try it just using the highlighter then. With bikes, there we go. Basically, what we do is we put them on the right side of the rightmost through lane, come through the intersection, and they basically stay all the way throughout in both directions. Fairly straightforward. If for future conditions, what we would like to do on other DDIs is perhaps build in a scoop. So the moment that they cross over this crossover intersection, instead of being caught and pinned behind the roadway and the rail here, if it's wide enough to basically scoop them up and put them in the inside. One of the things that it's also coming into play at this point, and I think this is going to be something that we're going to look to implement going forward, because this came up for the first time on the interchange that we're doing right now in Brisbane. One of the issues that the Australians pointed out, and keep in mind, they've got two that are, one in the ground and one that's that's in final design now. And we have hundreds here that are in design, and it never came up here in the US. Is the fact that when you're looking at an intersection like this, the distance from this point to this point, if you factor in the running speed of bicycles, here the design speed for cars is 35 miles per hour. The running speed for a bicycle, particularly if this is a DDI up and over the top, you're asking a bicyclist to go uphill as they go across that wide opening. Is there a need to potentially extend either the red or delay the green, or extend the green for one side or the other, or do something having to do with bicycle signalization to avoid a situation where a bicyclist is caught in the middle of that interchange? Now, if you think about a standard diamond intersection or a standard intersection of any kind, and a bicyclist is going through and he gets through just before it turns yellow, the very first phase that he's usually going to conflict with, he or she is usually going to conflict with, is the opposing left turns coming off the crossroads. But those left turns will have ample visibility to that bicyclist that's coming across. They'll be able to see them. They'll be right in front of them, or they're going to be somewhere nearby. On the other hand, if you have a bicyclist coming out of the core, this way, you have a much wider piece of pavement. They're not going to be on the second to last lane or the last lane before they make it through. They may be right in the middle of that pavement. And that's a significantly different challenge altogether. So one of the things that we're looking at on this next project that we're working on in Florida is the implementation of separate bicycle signals that will go yellow and all red prior to the vehicular traffic going yellow and all red, where the interchange area is wide enough to justify that kind of a treatment. So that was probably far more detailed, a can of worms than you thought you were asking about.
That was interesting. Thank you. Cadell, I think this time we definitely have a question in the chat that we haven't covered.
Let's see. Yeah, we do have a question. So Benita asks, has Smith seen any bicycle traffic recorded using a diverging diamond interchange? Honestly, I would imagine a bike or ped crossing bridge.
We entertained a bike or ped crossing bridge at the Louisville, Colorado DDI, which is, give me 1 second to pull it up, this one. Especially since at this location, we were asking a ton of pedestrians to be in the core of the interchange because your express bus routes had terminals here and here. And this is basically a transfer station in between those. Now, have I ever recorded one? No, but I've been out on so many of these sites that I have seen plenty of bicyclists navigate DDIs. For the most part, what I see them do is to go into the median. So instead of running along the right side of the rightmost through lane on the bike lane or shoulder, they'll oftentimes basically slow down and then hit the ramp and come into the core of the interchange. The Brisbane DDI, actually it's, I forget the name of the town now. It's just north of Brisbane. The DDI that we're building there intentionally has a scoop for bicyclists to get them up and into the core so they're not running adjacent to live traffic.
I have another question, Smith. How does the bike, and I guess mostly pedestrian safety at DDIs compare with other interchange? Like it's becoming more common, but it's not as common yet.
Yes, there is a misconception that somehow DDIs will be more dangerous or they're scarier or what have you. So I'm going to bring up two things. Okay, so imagine, compared to a standard diamond here, imagine that you're crossing this location right here. When a pedestrian is trying to make this crossing, he potentially could get hit by this direction or this direction. Likewise, if you're trying to cross the receiving side over here, you can get hit from this direction, or potentially somebody coming through for whatever reason. But at every opening that a pedestrian has to navigate, they will have to navigate multiple directions of potential conflicting flow. So if you look at the way a DDI is done, and this one is one of those where it runs into the middle, at each one of the pedestrian crossings, they are only crossing one direction of travel at a time. And as opposed to this, where it is curb to curb, in all likelihood, even though this is a single lane ramp, you're talking about a curb to curb distance somewhere around 40, 42 feet, most likely. Here, those crossings are more or less perpendicular to the traffic flow itself. Even though this is a single lane, you're really crossing about 20-ish feet. So the crossings are discrete, they're much shorter, and you're only crossing one potential movement at a time. No matter what opening you're crossing at a DDI, the pedestrian only has to look in one direction because there's only one flow that they need to worry about. So from a theoretical standpoint, we surmise that it would be safer. But frankly speaking, the before and after studies that have been done, they have yielded very good CMFs for cars, simply because there's plenty of data for cars. 99.9% of the traffic that goes through an interchange is vehicular traffic. We simply don't have a statistically significant amount of data to come up with a quote unquote CMF for multimodal or active transportation modes. One of the interchanges that I will tell you about is that DDI in Colorado. This particular one in Colorado, it was one of their top 5 accident locations in the entire state. And this isn't located in Denver or Boulder or Colorado Springs. This is kind of in between the two towns, and it's in a suburban area. They used to average 5 fatalities a year here, and they had, I think, 3 fatalities in the 6 years, 3 pedestrian fatalities in the 6 years leading to the implementation of this interchange. Since this, in the first, I don't know the stats for the last 12 months, but in the first 18 months, this interchange was open to traffic. The only accidents that occurred here were property damage only, and none of them involved pedestrians. So that's anecdotal information from one site, but between the theory, how we protect them, how we signal protect them, what they have to deal with in terms of information overload, and what they need to look for at each conflict point, that would suggest to me that it would be a significant improvement.
Yeah.
All right, well, I believe it is time for happy hour. So let's see.
Well, thank you, Smith, for the presentation, and thanks to all the presenters too for being with us today. So
Thank you.
I hope everyone learned something. And again, the recording will be available to ITE members.
And Smith, there are a few comments in the chat from Michael about the advice to design the final state first really applies to all types of design, and that he's done many traffic signal designs that way too.
Absolutely, totally agreed. Otherwise, you end up with stupid stuff like poles and mast arms in locations where you need the laneage later.
Great. and that he's been looking forward to presentations on DDIs ever since he saw you working on these designs while attending other ITE events. Yeah.
Oh, I'm touched. Thank you very much.
And a few more coming in. So fun presentation as always. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Great. So, Cadell, right. We were trying to do breakout rooms for this one, but we don't have that. That won't work with this link, right? We need to send out